There are moments in human history when the silence between ages feels heavier than the ages themselves, when the ruins of forgotten worlds seem to whisper of chapters torn away before any chronicle could bind them. And as scholars trace the edges of humanity's earliest cities, they find themselves staring into a void so profound that it challenges every assumption about how civilization began. At the center of that void lies the enigma of Sumer, a civilization that did not rise gradually but appeared almost fully formed, like a memory resurfacing after epochs of amnesia. It emerges from the Mesopotamian plain with a brilliance too refined, too synchronized, too sudden for the slow march of human development. And so a question rises, as old as the first myths carved into clay, yet sharp enough to cut through our modern certainty. What if the gods of Sumer were not celestial beings at all, but survivors of a far older world, a world erased by fire, water, and time? The weight of this question grows when we consider how civilizations normally unfold. Stone to copper, copper to bronze, tribes to villages, villages to kingdoms. Yet in Sumer's case, this sequence seems to reverse itself, as though its founders were not learning, but remembering. Writing appears not in rudimentary scratches, but in full administrative complexity. Astronomy enters the stage not with simple sky watching, but with mapped cycles and structured observations. Urban planning arises not from trial and error, but from deliberate design. It is as if Sumer did not invent the building blocks of civilization, but inherited them. And here, in this improbable emergence, the ancient world begins to tremble with implications long ignored. For when the first cities rose in Mesopotamia, the earth was still carrying the scars of a cataclysm that reshaped coastlines, rivers, and the memory of humankind. The ice sheets had collapsed, the seas had surged, and the world that existed before was swept away with terrifying permanence. Only fragments of that age survive in myth. Tales of golden epochs, lost paradises, and beings who walked among early humans with knowledge that seemed beyond mortal reach. These are the figures we later named gods, yet beneath their divine veneers linger the unmistakable traits of leaders, architects, navigators, and scientists. And if such survivors fled the drowning shores of a world that no longer exists, where would they have gone, except the fertile plains that would one day cradle Sumer? The Sumerians themselves never claimed to have invented their civilization. They wrote that it was bestowed. They insisted that kingship descended from the heavens, that knowledge was delivered by beings who carried the memory of a world before the flood. To modern ears, these are myths, but to ancient scribes, they were recollections, traces of something too monumental to forget. And when we strip away the mythic language, a new possibility emerges, that the so-called gods were the last custodians of a dying civilization, fighting to preserve what little they could from the encroaching darkness. If this is true, then the first spark of Sumer was not a beginning, but a reignition. A torch passed from one epoch to the next, carried across the wreckage of continents and the fading of human memory. And in that passing, something of the old world lingered, not in ruins or artifacts, for those had been claimed by the rising seas, but in knowledge, the architecture of cities, the geometry of temples, the structure of time, and the stories of a creation that sounded less like myth and more like a record of survival. These were the seeds planted in the soil of Mesopotamia, waiting for the right moment to take root again. Yet even as we consider this possibility, another question forms in the shadows. If Sumer was the echo, what was the source? What kind of civilization existed before the one we call the first? The standard timeline offers no refuge here, for it cannot explain the suddenness of Sumer's emergence. Something is missing, and its absence is so profound that it distorts the entire shape of early history. The archaeological layers whisper of settlements older than expected, of symbolic traditions too advanced for their time, of knowledge carried across generations with a purpose that feels less cultural and more protective. It is as if humanity itself was entrusted with a legacy it barely understood. In this light, The Sumerian gods transform into something entirely different from the beings carved on ancient tablets. They become survivors of a civilizational collapse so vast that later generations could only encode its memory in mythic form. Their descent from the heavens becomes the poetic retelling of refugees arriving from coastal realms swallowed by rising waters. Their gifts of writing, agriculture, and astronomy become the last remnants of an inheritance salvaged from ruins now hidden beneath the world's oceans, and their authority becomes the fragile bridge between a lost world and a new one struggling to rise from the mud. Some might dismiss this as romantic speculation, yet the narrative fits too neatly into the unanswered silence of early civilization. The abrupt sophistication of Sumer speaks not of invention, but resurrection. The myths of divine teachers resemble encoded history more than theology, and the global memory of a catastrophic flood aligns with geological events once thought impossible. When these strands entwine, they form a tapestry of possibility that feels both ancient and startlingly new. It is a reminder that history is not a closed book, but a fragmented manuscript, scattered across continents and waiting for patient hands to reassemble it. For now, the Mesopotamian plain remains quiet, its temples worn by millennia of wind and sand. But beneath that silence echoes a truth too large to erase. Sumer did not appear from nothing. Something ancient stood behind it, shaping its rise, guiding its memory, and embedding within its myths the faint outline of a world long gone. And as we step deeper into this mystery, the question that opened our journey returns, stronger than before. What if the gods of Sumer were not gods at all, but the last witnesses of a civilization the earth itself tried to bury? And if that is true, then somewhere in the ruins of time lies a story even older than Sumer, waiting for us to uncover the pieces of a world we were never meant to forget. The question left lingering at the close of the first chapter sharpens as we move deeper into the historical record, and its weight grows heavier when placed against the stark improbability of Sumer's appearance. For when archaeologists chart humanity's slow ascent from scattered hunter-gatherer groups to organized settlements, the curve is gentle, gradual, and predictable. Yet the moment Sumer enters the scene, that curve snaps upward with a velocity that defies conventional explanation. It is here, in this sudden leap, that the historical problem becomes impossible to ignore. By all known measures of technological and social development, the Sumerians should not exist as early as they do. Their sophistication belongs to a chapter far later in the human story, yet it stands firmly at the beginning, like a misplaced monument left by hands no one can fully identify. The strangeness deepens when we examine the timeline more closely. Around the 4th millennium BCE, long before Egypt's pyramids rose or the first Chinese dynasties emerged, the cities of Sumer were already thriving. Uruk stretched across the plains with monumental temples, administrative districts, and residential quarters arranged with deliberate precision. Eridu, older still, bore the marks of repeated ritual rebuilding, suggesting a lineage of sacred memory carried through countless generations. And in both places, writing was not merely emerging, but fully functional, capable of tracking trade, recording myths, issuing decrees, and documenting astronomical observations that seem impossibly advanced for humanity's supposed developmental stage. This is not the infancy of civilization, it is its adolescence. Yet it appears at the very moment humans were expected to be learning how to walk. Modern historians often describe this as a sudden urban revolution, but even that phrase understates the mystery. Revolutions imply acceleration, not spontaneous emergence. Revolutions imply a buildup of tension, not a polished system appearing without prototypes. What we find in Sumer is not an experimental society stumbling toward complexity. It is a civilization beginning with a fully formed administrative apparatus, legal concepts, spiritual frameworks, and agricultural strategies that typically take thousands of years to evolve. The depth of their knowledge suggests continuity, not invention, as though an older blueprint guided their structure from the outset. Consider their mastery of irrigation, a technology that normally evolves through centuries of trial and error. The Sumerians implemented it immediately on a scale requiring generations of accumulated expertise. Their canals were not haphazard trenches, but engineered networks controlling water levels with remarkable precision. The efficiency of their agriculture should belong to a lineage much older than their recorded existence. It is as if the first Sumerians already knew the land intimately, carrying memories from landscapes now submerged beneath seas or buried beneath sediment left by ancient floods. Then there is the matter of writing itself. Cuneiform does not emerge as a primitive set of marks gradually refined across centuries. It arrives as a complete system, capable of representing transactions, mythic cosmogonies, and astronomical calculations. Linguists struggle to identify its origin because it appears without a clear precursor, a linguistic island isolated from the surrounding language families. No culture nearby shows the evolutionary steps expected of a writing system. Instead, it blooms in Sumer as though transplanted from a forgotten source. The mystery expands further when we consider their mathematical and administrative prowess. The earliest tablets reveal highly organized taxation, temple management, grain distribution, and legal principles that mirror much later societies. Yet here they are at the dawn of recorded time, presented with a maturity suggesting that someone had mastered these systems long before they were carved onto clay. It is as though Sumer began where an earlier civilization ended, inheriting not only knowledge, but the urgency to preserve it. This urgency appears most visibly in the sheer scale of their record-keeping. No culture at this early stage should feel compelled to document with such intensity, yet Sumer inscribed everything: transactions, land allotments, priestly duties, astronomical patterns, myths, and genealogies. It is the behavior of a people aware that something precious must not be lost again. Their tablets read not merely as administrative necessity, but as preservation, the echo of a memory too important to entrust to oral tradition alone. And so, the dilemma sharpens. If Sumer represents the first civilization, why does it bear the hallmarks of a second beginning? Why does its knowledge appear inherited rather than discovered? Why does its writing arrive fully formed, its cities fully conceptualized, its astronomy startlingly advanced? The conventional narrative strains under these questions, yet the tablets remain stubbornly clear. They speak of origins that do not align with gradual development. They speak of teachers, of founders, of beings who did not learn alongside humanity but stood apart, carrying wisdom from a time the earth itself buried beneath layers of mud and myth. In this light, the historical problem becomes something deeper than academic confusion. It becomes a fracture in the story of human civilization, a rupture suggesting an earlier chapter erased by cataclysm. And as we turn toward the Sumerian myths of creation, kingship, and divine instruction, we begin to see hints of that earlier world encoded within their stories. Their gods do not behave like the distant deities of later cultures. They direct construction, delineate boundaries, establish laws, and shape societal structure with the precision of rulers, not celestial abstractions. They act as if they remember something the humans around them do not. And so we return to the unsettling possibility that the Sumerian miracle is not a beginning at all, but a continuation, a torch passed through darkness from a civilization lost to time. If this is true, then the abrupt brilliance of Sumer becomes not an anomaly but a clue, pointing back toward a forgotten epoch whose remnants still flicker beneath the myths we dismiss as fiction. The question now is whether we dare follow that thread backward, into the realm of floods, vanished coastlines, and the shadows of a world the earth itself tried to erase. The thread extends inevitably toward the oldest tale humanity preserved, a story whispered across continents yet crystallized with unusual clarity in the clay tablets of Sumer. It is the tale of the Great Flood, a cataclysm so immense that it seems to mark the dividing line between worlds. And as we step into this chapter of their narrative, the archaeological earth begins to echo the myth with unsettling precision. For beneath the ancient cities of the Fertile Crescent lie layers of silt and debris that do not belong to normal river flooding. They are thick, abrupt, and uniform, as though poured by a single violent event. These layers interrupt the cultural strata like a scar, dividing what came before from what came after. And it is within this rupture that the story of Sumer begins to glow with a new, enigmatic light. The Sumerians remembered the flood not as metaphor, but as history. Their tablets describe a world already old when the waters rose, a world governed by kings whose reigns seemed impossibly long. They spoke of cities that thrived before the deluge and of beings who guided their foundations. When the waters finally swallowed that earlier age, only a handful survived, carrying with them fragments of knowledge that would later ignite the rebirth of civilization. This is the backdrop against which Sumer emerges, not from primordial simplicity, but from the aftermath of devastation. And when we place the archaeological record beside the mythic one, the correspondence becomes too striking to ignore. Excavations at sites such as Shuruppak, Kish, and Ur reveal telltale layers of flood sediment dating to the early 3rd millennium BCE, layers so distinct that they abruptly halt the evidence of earlier habitation. Yet these same layers are followed by renewed construction, as though survivors return to rebuild upon the ruins of what had been swept away. The flood deposits vary by region, suggesting not a single global inundation, but a series of catastrophic events associated with the tumultuous climate shifts that marked the end of the last ice age. Sea levels rose more than 400 feet over several millennia, erasing coastlines, swallowing river deltas, and wiping out settlements that would have lain near the ancient shores. In that rising tide, entire cultures could vanish without leaving a trace except through the memories carried by their descendants. The mythologies of the world echo this memory. In Mesopotamia, the hero Ziusudra survives the divine storm. In later Akkadian tradition, Utnapishtim endures the raging waters to become a symbol of a lost epoch. In the Hebrew narrative, Noah preserves life aboard his vessel. In India, Manu is warned of the coming flood by a mysterious being. In Mesoamerica, Coxcox and Xochiquetzal escape a world-ending deluge. These stories do not share details by coincidence. They share something older than writing. They share trauma. They carry the imprint of a civilization-ending event that forced humanity to begin again, reshaping the world so drastically that memories of the time before had to be encoded in mythic form to survive. Within this global chorus of flood memories, the Sumerian version feels less mythical and more like a chronological anchor, a record of a cultural fracture witnessed by those who lived closest to its aftermath. The king list speaks of rulers who reigned before the flood and of kingship descending again after the waters subsided, as though civilization did not originate in Sumer but re-emerged there. Such continuity implies that the survivors who returned or resettled in the region carried knowledge from the drowned cities of their past, knowledge that would later be interpreted as divine instruction. Their myths speak of gods lamenting the destruction, arguing among themselves about humanity's fate, and ultimately guiding the rebuilding process once the earth dried. But when stripped of their divine cloak, these tales bear the unmistakable silhouette of leaders who survived a disaster and struggled to restore order. Even the descriptions of the deluge align with geological evidence. Sudden sea incursions, glacial meltwater pulses, and shifting river courses reshaped the Mesopotamian plain repeatedly during prehistory. Evidence from the Persian Gulf suggests that it was once a vast, fertile valley, a cradle for early peoples now buried beneath the sea. If civilizations flourished along its ancient rivers, their destruction would leave little trace except through the memories of those who escaped inland. It becomes conceivable that the earliest Sumerians were not inventing civilization, but rebuilding it, guided by the descendants of those who witnessed the drowning of their original homeland. The mythic language of the flood reflects this duality between memory and metaphor. The gods are shocked by their own destructive force, suggesting that the catastrophe was not expected. The heroes receive warnings from beings determined to preserve life and knowledge. Instructions are given on constructing vessels, storing seeds, and carrying the animals needed to repopulate the world. These are not the concerns of deities, but of leaders tasked with the survival of their people. The Sumerian scribes, writing centuries later, would naturally elevate these figures to divine status, their memory magnified by reverence and time. Yet beneath the myth, the human struggle endures, hinting at a real event etched into the collective psyche of our species. As we examine these converging strands, the possibility that the Sumerian flood narrative encodes the fall of a previous civilization grows stronger, and with it comes the realization that the abrupt emergence of Sumer's brilliance may be the result of cultural inheritance rather than spontaneous innovation. Their knowledge of astronomy, architecture, and administration appears less mysterious if viewed as a reassembly of fragments from a shattered world. Their reverence for the beings who brought order after the chaos reflects the gratitude of survivors toward those who guided them through resettlement. And the persistent memory of a world drowned beneath rising waters reveals a continuity of experience stretching far beyond the confines of recorded history. Thus, as the deluge settles and the survivors begin to rebuild, Sumer rises not as humanity's first attempt at civilization, but as the first successful revival after an era-ending catastrophe. It is a lantern lit in the darkness left by a vanished world, carrying within its flame the faint but persistent glow of knowledge salvaged from the deep. And as we move forward, the implications of this possibility force us to revisit the very foundations of early human culture, questioning what was lost, what was preserved, and what truths may still lie buried beneath oceans and floodplains, waiting for our rediscovery. From the fading echoes of the flood, our attention drifts toward an even deeper question, one that lingers like a shadow behind every Sumerian myth and every archaeological layer disturbed by ancient waters. If Sumer arose in the aftermath of catastrophe, then what existed before? The Earth at the end of the last ice age was not the world we know. Coastlines stretched far beyond their modern boundaries, and vast lowland valleys now hidden beneath the Persian Gulf, the Mediterranean basin, and the Indonesian archipelago formed the heartlands of early human settlement. As the ice sheets collapsed and the seas surged upward, these coastlines vanished, swallowing any cities, temples, or harbors that may have thrived along their fertile shores. In this rising tide, the blueprint of an older civilization could have been erased so completely that only myth, memory, and scattered survivors remained to bear witness to what once stood upon lands now drowned. This possibility transforms the story of early humanity into something far more intricate than the linear progression painted in conventional timelines. For if entire cultures were submerged beneath the waters that reshaped the planet, then the survivors who fled inland would have carried with them a fragmentary memory of the world they lost. Their descendants, seeking to rebuild, would carve their knowledge into tablets, construct their cities on higher ground, and encode the fading stories of their ancestors into the myths that later generations would mistake for legend. In this framework, the sudden brilliance of Sumer becomes less an anomaly and more a signpost, a clue pointing back toward an age erased by rising seas and shifting climates. The remnants of that age might still lie beneath continental shelves, untouched by archaeologists, unreachable through traditional excavation, guarded by the silence of the deep. Modern bathymetric surveys have revealed submerged river channels across the floor of the Persian Gulf, tracing ancient paths that once nourished lush valleys and human settlements. These drowned landscapes could easily have supported complex societies, ones that thrived for millennia before the encroaching waters finally forced their inhabitants to abandon their homes. As the Gulf flooded wave by wave, decades decade by decade, those living along its shores would have watched their world shrink, their fields vanish, and their cities succumb to the tide. And when the last dry promontories disappeared, the survivors would have migrated inland, carrying with them precious knowledge that would someday ignite the rebirth of civilization on the Mesopotamian plain. The memory of this exodus could very well be the seed from which the Sumerian myth of divine descent grew, not a literal arrival from the sky, but the arrival of people from a world the seas swallowed whole. The idea of pre-Sumerian civilizations has long been dismissed as speculative, yet evidence scattered across the globe suggests that humanity achieved symbolic, architectural, and astronomical sophistication far earlier than once believed. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Anatolia, built over 6,000 years before Sumer, challenges the assumption that hunter-gatherers lacked the organizational capacity to construct monumental structures. Its stone enclosures and symbolic carvings whisper of a cultural lineage stretching far into prehistory, hinting at traditions carried from an even older source. If such a site represents the memory of a lost world, then Sumer might be its inheritor, the civilization that finally stabilized the fragments of knowledge drifting through the millennia after the cataclysm. The post-Ice Age world was a landscape in transition, shaped not only by rising seas, but by violent climate fluctuations, shifting river systems, and the collapse of ecosystems that had supported human communities for tens of thousands of years. In this turmoil, the survivors of coastal civilizations would have found refuge in new regions, bringing with them technologies and teachings adapted to unfamiliar environments. The earliest temples of Eridu echo this pattern. They appear not as tentative experiments, but as well-defined structures rebuilt repeatedly on the same sacred foundations, as if the memory of an older holy site guided their reconstruction. These early Sumerian centers may represent attempts to recreate something that existed before, an echo of a place now submerged beneath forgotten waters. And in this light, the notion of survivors becomes more than metaphor. It becomes an organizing thread through which the earliest chapters of civilization can be reinterpreted. The founders of Sumer may have been cultural heirs of communities destroyed during the climatic upheavals that closed the Ice Age. Their myths, rather than inventions, may have been encoded recollections of real events, reframed through symbolism as human memory blurred across generations. The gods who taught them could have been leaders, engineers, or scholars from those drowned lands, remembered through reverent exaggeration. Their sacred knowledge may have been the last remnants of methodologies perfected long before Sumer's brick temples rose from the floodplain. As we explore this possibility, the world before Sumer comes into focus not as a primitive wilderness, but as a forgotten chapter of human potential. Its cities may lie beneath hundreds of feet of water, hidden beneath sediments deposited over thousands of years. Its libraries, its monuments, its records, if any survived, remain inaccessible to us. Yet their influence persists in the sudden maturity of Sumerian society. The survivors of that drowned age would have been forced to rebuild quickly, driven by memory rather than invention, urgency rather than experimentation. Their descendants would inherit a fractured but potent legacy, one that, when finally stabilized in the Mesopotamian plain, appeared to modern observers as an inexplicable leap forward. The earth has a way of concealing its past, burying its earliest stories where few can retrieve them. But sometimes, those stories bleed through in the myths and rituals of the cultures that rise afterward. Sumer's myths of divine descent, pre-flood rulers, and ancient knowledge do not read like the imaginings of a people inventing civilization. They read like the guarded memories of those who survived a world-shattering loss. And as we turn toward the next chapter of this narrative, the focus sharpens upon the figures Sumer called gods, beings who arrive with purpose, authority, and knowledge. If they were not divine, Then who were they? And what remnants of their forgotten civilization did they carry into the cradle of the world's first reborn society? They came, according to the oldest tablets, not as distant abstractions drifting through cosmic realms, but as purposeful figures stepping into a world still trembling from catastrophe. The Sumerians called them the Anunna, later the Anunnaki, beings who descended to shape order from chaos. Yet, when their stories are read without theological framing, a startling reinterpretation emerges. These were not gods in the later sense of omnipotent deities. They were leaders. They were organizers. They were the survivors of something vast, arriving with a determination that seems rooted not in divine whim but in memory. Their actions resemble not miracles, but reconstruction. They behave like those who carry the last embers of an extinguished world, protecting that fragile light from being swallowed by the darkness of forgetting. And as they move through the early myths of Sumer, their presence feels less supernatural and more historical, as though the memory of real individuals had been wrapped in symbolic reverence across generations. The earliest Sumerian texts describe these beings forming councils, assigning territories, and directing the construction of temples and irrigation works. They instruct humanity in agriculture, writing, laws, and rituals, yet their guidance resembles the pedagogy of experienced administrators rather than the acts of transcendent gods. Enki maps out canals with precision, suggesting a mind intimately familiar with hydraulic engineering. Enlil establishes social order, defining roles, boundaries, and hierarchies as a statesman might in a newly founded polity. Inanna brings the arts of rulership, diplomacy, and even warfare, her narratives echoing the stories of charismatic leaders who shaped the destiny of early cities. These portraits feel too grounded, too human, to be the inventions of a society just learning to build cities. They feel like memories refracted through the lens of myth, a people honoring those who guided them when the world felt young again. If these figures were real, then the question becomes, from where did they come? The myths speak of their arrival from the high places or from realms beyond the waters, phrases that, stripped of poetic adornment, could describe refugees descending from mountains or migrating inland from the drowned coasts of a lost world. Their names may encode titles rather than divine identities, their familial dramas echoing political conflicts carried over from a homeland that no longer exists. To a traumatized population rebuilding life after disaster, the survivors of an advanced, vanished culture would appear as beings of another realm, their knowledge incomprehensible yet desperately needed. Over time, their mortal features would fade beneath layers of reverence, until only the mythic silhouettes remained. The Sumerians themselves hinted at this ambiguity. The term Dingir, often translated as God, carried connotations not only of divinity, but of exalted status, authority, and luminous presence. A leader who possessed knowledge beyond the comprehension of ordinary people could easily be described in such terms without implying supernatural origins. In a world recovering from collapse, the difference between advanced survivors and divine beings would blur. To those who had lost everything, knowledge itself was divine, and those who preserved it became the stewards of civilization's rebirth. The structured behavior of the Anunnaki reflects this logic. They do not behave like mythological gods who create worlds through effortless power. They plan, deliberate, argue, and compromise. They face limitations. They worry about resources, food, labor, and social stability. Their actions reflect long-term strategy rather than cosmic omnipotence. In the flood myth, they fear the consequences of their own decisions and lament the devastation they help unleash. This emotional and practical complexity feels more consistent with the memories of mortal leaders than with the attributes of deities. Their arrival marks a turning point in the Sumerian narrative, the moment when humanity transitions from scattered post-cataclysmic survivors to organized builders capable of constructing cities and managing resources. The temples they established served not only religious functions but administrative ones, storing grain, regulating trade, recording transactions, and mediating disputes. These institutions resemble the remnants of an earlier sophisticated system, transplanted into a new environment by those who remembered how such systems once operated. The priests who later inherited these roles preserved rituals that may have originated as practical procedures, codified by necessity rather than faith. The myths describe the Anunnaki granting humanity the me, sacred decrees governing everything from kingship to weaving, but these decrees can be interpreted as the remnants of cultural disciplines carried from an older society. Their transmission in mythic form suggests an attempt to preserve knowledge so foundational that it could not be allowed to vanish. In this interpretation, the divine gifting of the me becomes a metaphor for the transfer of institutional memory, the passing of responsibilities from the last custodians of a dying civilization to the first citizens of a new one rising from the mud. Such a reinterpretation aligns with the broader context of post-flood recovery. A collapsed civilization would not vanish without leaving traces in the stories of those who survived. The Sumerian gods, then, become the narrative vessels through which the memory of that older world endured. Their titles, attributes, and conflicts may preserve fragments of leadership structures, cultural tensions, and technological expertise carried through the generations by those who had witnessed the end of their world. For the Sumerians, recalling their origins meant recalling these extraordinary figures who had guided their ancestors through a time of upheaval. Myth became the language through which a shattered memory reconstructed itself. As this perspective settles into place, an image emerges of a people rebuilding while honoring the last guardians of an earlier epoch. And as Sumer absorbs the legacy of these enigmatic figures, its language, institutions, and cosmology begin to reflect the faint outlines of a forgotten past. The next chapter of this journey leads us into the realm of that language itself, a linguistic relic whose isolation may hold the fingerprints of an entire civilization lost beneath ancient seas. The language of Sumer rises from the tablets with a strangeness that mirrors the mystery of its civilization. It stands alone, connected to no known linguistic family, carrying structures and patterns that defy classification. Scholars call it a language isolate, yet that term feels insufficient to capture its depth. Sumerian is not merely isolated, it is anomalous, appearing without precursors, relatives, or evolutionary stages. It emerges fully formed, like a relic carried intact across a boundary that erased everything else. And as we examine its peculiar architecture, the possibility grows that Sumerian is not the language of a first civilization, but the surviving echo of a lost one. Its very existence becomes a clue, a linguistic fossil preserving the cadence of a world washed away by ancient waters. In most regions, languages evolve gradually, leaving behind intermediary forms, dialects, inscriptions, and oral residues that track their development. But in Mesopotamia, nothing precedes Sumerian. No fragments hint at earlier versions. No inscriptions reveal its slow refinement. The earliest tablets already display complex grammatical structures, suggesting a mature linguistic system carried by a population whose ancestors had spoken it long before they arrived on the Mesopotamian plain. Its grammar is intricate, agglutinative, stacking meaning upon meaning in layered particles that reflect a worldview shaped by millennia of cultural refinement. This level of sophistication does not emerge from an illiterate society experimenting with written communication for the first time. It reflects a linguistic tradition that must have developed elsewhere, in a context that left no trace except through the people who survived its destruction. The script, too, reveals hints of an older origin. Cuneiform begins not with pictorial simplicity, but with a system already adapted for accounting, administration, and mythological narration. The earliest tablets speak of measures, offerings, duties, and celestial phenomena, all encoded with a fluency that implies writing was already a familiar tool. If Sumerian were truly the first experiment in written language, we would expect to find crude attempts, tentative glyphs, abandoned prototypes. Instead, we encounter a disciplined system shaped by centuries of refinement. Such fluency suggests not innovation, but survival, the continuation of a tradition transplanted into new soil by those determined to preserve memory through the permanence of clay. Even the structure of Sumerian thought, its metaphors, its symbolic associations, its mythopoetic expressions, feels less like the awakening of a young culture and more like the adaptation of an older intellectual framework to a changed world. Its words for temple, law, and leadership carry meanings that suggest inheritance rather than invention, as though these concepts were brought from elsewhere already fully understood. The naming of cities, deities, and celestial bodies follows patterns hinting at an earlier cosmology, one transmitted through generations who clung to their ancestral knowledge as they rebuilt after catastrophe. The very rhythm of Sumerian seems to bear the imprint of collective memory, shaped not by the formative experiences of Mesopotamia alone, but by distant landscapes now hidden beneath oceans. If we imagine the survivors of a drowned civilization arriving in a world transformed by rising seas and shifting climates, the preservation of language becomes essential. Language is not only communication, it is identity, continuity, a vessel for memory. In moments of upheaval, displaced peoples cling to their tongue as a lifeline connecting them to their lost homeland. The earliest Sumerians, settling along the banks of the Euphrates and Tigris, may have spoken a language inherited from ancestors who once lived in coastal cities now buried beneath sediment. Their speech would carry the last echoes of traditions erased physically but preserved culturally. And as they rebuilt, their language would become the foundation upon which they structured their temples, their rituals, and their understanding of the cosmos. The linguistic isolation of Sumerian thus becomes a quiet but powerful witness to a broken historical chain. It suggests that whatever culture birthed the language did not survive intact into the later millennia. Only fragments persisted, carried by a population forced to migrate inland as their world vanished. This pattern resembles the linguistic vestiges found in regions touched by ancient catastrophes, where isolated groups preserve tongues once widespread, but later fragmented by environmental collapse. The absence of linguistic relatives for Sumerian may reflect not uniqueness, but loss. Entire language families washed away along with the civilizations that spoke them. The earliest myths reinforce this idea of survival. They describe a time before the flood when the gods established the order of the world, assigning languages to humanity and determining the roles of cities that would rise again after the waters receded. The confusion of tongues appears not as punishment, but as a symbolic memory of dispersal, a recollection of groups scattering across landscapes reshaped by disaster. Sumerian may be the survivor of that dispersal, the one tongue carried intact through the upheaval, because its speakers were numerous, resilient, or fortunate enough to endure where others could not. Even more striking is the fact that later Mesopotamian cultures, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, continued to use Sumerian long after it ceased to be spoken. They treated it as a sacred language of scholarship, ritual, and cosmic understanding. This reverence resembles the way cultures treat ancestral languages inherited from distant, revered epics. Latin in medieval Europe, Sanskrit in classical India, and the hieroglyphic script in post-pharaonic Egypt all served as symbolic bridges to a past regarded as more illuminated than the present. Sumerian held a similar role. To the civilizations that followed, it represented a connection to an age whose origins lay beyond the threshold of known history. This suggests that even the ancients sensed its antiquity, understanding that the language carried a legacy older than their own records could capture. If Sumerian is a relic, then it may contain within its structure the fingerprints of a forgotten worldview, Its metaphors may encode memories of environments no longer visible. Its terms for architecture may reflect designs inspired by buildings that no longer exist. Its astronomical vocabulary may preserve observations made in latitudes or conditions lost to time. And its grammar may hold echoes of a cultural logic shaped by experiences now buried beneath layers of earth and water. Each tablet becomes a fragment of a linguistic mosaic once far larger, offering subtle glimpses into the consciousness of a civilization whose ruins have been erased. Thus, the language of Sumer does more than communicate. It mourns, it preserves, it remembers. It stands as one of the last remaining artifacts of a world that died before history began. And as we follow this thread forward, the next stage of our journey leads us to the stars, where Sumer's astronomical knowledge reveals patterns no young civilization should understand. A celestial inheritance suggesting that the survivors who built Sumer carried with them not only language, but the memory of a sky observed for millennia before the flood reshaped the earth. The sky becomes the next witness, a silent archive that remembers what the earth has forgotten. For when we examine the astronomical tablets of Sumer, their precision unsettles even the most conservative scholars. These early observers did not simply note the rising and setting of the stars. They tracked patterns requiring centuries of continuous observation, cycles so subtle that no young civilization could have discovered them in a single lifetime. Among these records, the Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa stands as a monument of impossible knowledge. It traces the appearances and disappearances of Venus, with a regularity implying long-term data collection, charting cycles that span well beyond the years of any one reign, any single observatory, any single generation. Yet the Sumerians possessed these cycles from their earliest eras, as if they inherited an astronomical tradition already ancient, a tradition refined by a culture with stability and continuity, stretching into a past erased by the deluge. The Venus cycle itself is intricate, requiring observation of morning and evening risings across an 8-year pattern that repeats with subtle irregularities. To master this cycle is not extraordinary. Any dedicated sky-watching society could do so with time. But to perfect its predictive model, as the Sumerians appear to have done, demands centuries of uninterrupted observation. It necessitates recording not only the broad cycle, but the minor deviations that accumulate over decades. A society recovering from catastrophe should not have possessed the stability or the institutional framework to maintain such records generation after generation. Yet Sumer emerges into history already equipped with this inherited understanding, as though their founders carried celestial data from a world that had tracked the heavens long before Mesopotamia became habitable. Their knowledge of eclipses reveals an even deeper mystery. The ability to predict lunar and solar eclipses requires mastery of the Saros cycle, a period of over 18 years that only becomes meaningful when observed across numerous repetitions. Even identifying the Saros requires long-term sky patterns recorded with disciplined consistency. Sumerian texts, however fragmentary, hint at awareness of these cycles far earlier than expected. Their scribes cataloged omens tied to the darkness of the sun and the shadowed face of the moon, not as superstitions, but as components of a systematic celestial understanding. They viewed the heavens as a clock whose gears could be mapped, a structure whose patterns could be anticipated rather than feared. Such a worldview suggests that their astronomical tradition was not in its infancy, but already sophisticated, refined, and deeply rooted in memories extending beyond the flood. The alignment of temples reinforces this possibility. Ziggurats were not random constructions. They served as both terrestrial anchors and celestial markers. their corners often aligned with cardinal directions, their stairways rising toward specific stars or planetary paths. These alignments imply that Sumerian priest astronomers understood not just seasonal shifts, but the slow dance of the heavens across centuries. Some temple orientations reflect an awareness of the lunar standstill cycle, a phenomenon requiring at least 18.5 years to observe, yet consistent only through long-term tradition. Others hint at an understanding of stellar transitions tied to precessional movement, a cycle so gradual that it takes over 25,000 years to complete. While it would be rash to claim full knowledge of precession, the architectural echoes suggest that the builders inherited patterns established by people who had once watched the sky with an intensity born from necessity or reverence. In myth, this celestial inheritance appears in symbolic form. The gods are associated with stars and planets not as abstract identifications, but as markers of skilled observation. Inanna is Venus, not merely in poetic metaphor, but in detailed astronomical correlation. Nana, the moon god, governs cycles essential for agriculture, ritual, and timekeeping. Utu, the sun god, becomes the embodiment of predictable passage, the organizer of days. These divine attributions reveal a culture deeply attuned to the heavens, yet what makes them remarkable is their early sophistication. Civilizations typically deify natural forces before quantifying them, yet Sumer seems to have done both at once, as though the quantification predated the myth, as though their symbolic system evolved from knowledge already well established. Even their calendar reflects inherited wisdom. The Sumerian lunisolar calendar demonstrates an understanding of the discrepancy between lunar months and solar years. This knowledge normally emerges only after long-term agricultural necessity reveals the drift between seasons and religious festivals. Yet Sumer's earliest calendar shows knowledge of intercalation strategies, techniques that require centuries of observational refinement to implement effectively. Such mastery suggests a culture that not only tracked time, but understood its underlying mechanics, as though they were preserving a temporal discipline developed by predecessors now lost to the depths. When viewed collectively, these astronomical features form a pattern too consistent to dismiss. They point toward a civilization beginning with data, not seeking it, inheriting celestial charts, not building them from scratch. The Sumerians, in this light, appear as custodians of a sky-watching tradition born in an earlier world, a world with the leisure, stability, and intellectual infrastructure to observe the heavens across generations. The collapse of that world, whether through flood, climate upheaval, or other catastrophe, would have fractured its institutions, scattering its survivors. Those who reached Mesopotamia would have carried fragments of their knowledge encoded in memory, in ritual, in sacred stories, and in practical strategies that later scribes transformed into mythological narratives. The Venus tablet, then, becomes not an origin, but a remnant, a shard of a greater astronomical heritage salvaged from a drowned world. The eclipse records become echoes of celestial cycles, tracked by ancestral observatories that no longer stand. The ziggurats become architectural descendants of temples built along coastlines, now submerged beneath the Persian Gulf. And the myths become metaphors for a knowledge nearly lost, preserved only because its custodians understood its fragility in the face of overwhelming destruction. This perspective reshapes our understanding of Sumerian astronomy. It transforms their achievements from anomalies into clues, indicators of a deeper continuity reaching across a forgotten boundary of time. And as we follow this continuity forward, we arrive at the next puzzle, the mathematics that underpins their celestial observations. A numerical system remarkably advanced, astonishingly elegant, and fully formed at its earliest appearance, as though it too were inherited from a civilization that mastered numbers long before Sumer built its first cities. The numerical world of Sumer opens like a quiet revelation, a system so elegant and self-contained that it feels less invented than remembered. Their mathematics emerges already mature, already structured, already tuned to the rhythms of the cosmos and the needs of administration. At its core lies the sexagesimal base, the now famous base 60 system, whose fingerprints persist in the very way we measure time and space. Minutes, seconds, degrees, and circles are all remnants of Sumerian thought, yet the origin of this numerical framework has never been satisfactorily explained. No evolutionary ladder leads to it. No simpler proto-system foreshadows its arrival. Base 60 appears with the same abrupt completeness that characterizes Sumer's writing, astronomy, and city planning. It is as if the civilization that rose after the flood was not constructing mathematics from raw experimentation, but reviving a structure carried across generations from a world that no longer existed. Base 60 is not an intuitive choice for a society just beginning to count. Most early cultures gravitated toward base 10, perhaps because of the clarity of human digits or the simplicity of grouping by tens. But base 60 demands a conceptual leap far beyond the immediate environment, one that requires recognizing the unique advantages of a number divisible by so many factors. 60 can be split into equal parts by 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, making it extraordinarily flexible for trade, architecture, astronomy, and early science. The use of 360 degrees in a circle echoes this logic, dividing the sky and the earth into segments aligned with celestial motions. Yet the presence of such a system at the very dawn of Sumerian civilization suggests that it was not an invention tailored to new conditions, but a preservation of an older intellectual heritage whose practicality had long been proven. The earliest tablets reveal multiplication tables, reciprocals, geometric calculations, and problem-solving methods far beyond what should exist in humanity's first urban culture. These texts display not tentative steps, but confident application, the work of a society already comfortable with abstract manipulation of numbers. Their scribes trained in schools where mathematics was taught as a structured discipline, not a new experiment. They solved irrigation problems using formulas hinting at knowledge passed down from instructors who themselves inherited traditions from an age predating the settled landscape of Mesopotamia. The sophistication of these calculations implies continuity, not sudden creation, as though the builders of Sumer were reviving mental tools carried from drowned homelands where such knowledge had once ensured survival. Timekeeping reveals this continuity even more vividly. The division of the day into hours, the hour into 60 minutes, and the minute into 60 seconds reflects a temporal architecture that seems designed for astronomical alignment rather than daily convenience. To construct such a system requires observing celestial cycles with patience extending across centuries. The Sumerians did precisely this, but their earliest records show no learning curve, no experimental drift. Instead, they present a cohesive temporal machine, one that meshes seamlessly with their astronomical tables and ritual calendars. This synchronization suggests a legacy system, one too refined to have been assembled by the same people who were simultaneously establishing the foundations of urban life. It feels inherited, perfected, long before Sumer itself existed. The geometry embedded in their architecture also hints at older origins. The layout of cities such as Uruk and Eridu, with their planned districts and measured spaces, reflects mathematical reasoning uncommon for nascent civilizations. Ziggurats rise with proportional precision, their stepped forms echoing geometric principles mirrored in ancient observations of the sky. The builders did not merely stack bricks. They worked within numerical frameworks that allowed them to scale their structures predictably. This level of coordination demands generations of practice. It suggests that those who led Sumer's early construction were guided by memory, an internal blueprint stemming from a world where where such principles had already been established. One could argue that Sumer achieved a brilliant leap of innovation, but the pattern across their entire cultural body argues otherwise. Civilizations rarely develop writing, astronomy, mathematics, monumental architecture, and administrative systems simultaneously. Each domain typically evolves in stages, feeding the next through slow accumulation. Yet in Sumer, these elements appear intertwined from the beginning, forming an integrated intellectual ecosystem. Such integration points toward inheritance, not invention. A recovering civilization would indeed rely on memory to rebuild, drawing upon fragments preserved through oral tradition and guarded by a small group of survivors or descendants who understood the old systems. These custodians would pass down knowledge in simplified or symbolic forms until the community regained stability, at which point the knowledge would be restructured into written form. This may explain why early Sumerian mathematics is both complete in its logic and yet expressed through symbols and methods, suggesting adaptation from earlier prototypes. Their fascination with circles, cycles, and repeating patterns reinforces the possibility that their mathematical worldview emerged from a culture deeply attuned to celestial rhythms. Base 60's compatibility with astronomical observation gives it an advantage that would only become apparent to societies accustomed to tracking the heavens over millennia. The synchronization of lunar and solar calendars, the tracking of planetary cycles, and the determination of solstices and equinoxes all benefit from a system divisible into numerous fractional segments. The fact that Sumer began with such a system implies that their ancestors were not merely sky watchers, but astronomers of a level rarely attributed to prehistoric groups. Consider, too, the symbolic resonance of their mathematics. Numbers in Sumer carry meaning beyond calculation. They mark sacred measures, ritual proportions, and cosmic harmonies embedded in myths describing the ordering of the universe. This merging of numerical and spiritual significance suggests a legacy older than the flood, a cultural memory in which numbers played a role not only in administration but in cosmology. Such symbolic systems rarely emerge without deep historical roots. They evolve across generations of refinement, shaped by the worldview of societies for whom mathematics served as the language of the divine. If Sumer inherited such traditions, then their numbers became not inventions but relics, fragments of a forgotten philosophy encoded in calculation. In this light, the mathematical brilliance of Sumer becomes less an anomaly and more a clue, pointing back toward a civilization that mastered numerical abstraction long before Sumer planted its first cuneiform tablet in wet clay. A civilization that may have watched the skies from temples now submerged, that may have charted celestial cycles while navigating coastlines now erased, that may have passed down its intellectual legacy through survivors who fled rising waters and found refuge in the plains of Mesopotamia. Thus, mathematics joins language, astronomy, and myth as a thread linking Sumer to a deeper past. And as these threads weave together, they guide us toward the physical expressions of this inherited knowledge, the cities themselves, whose walls and temples rise not as experiments, but as confident declarations of a restored order. Our next step leads us into those cities, where architecture becomes the stone-bound memory of a world struggling to rebuild itself from the echoes of a lost age. The cities of Sumer rise from the plain with a sense of intention so deliberate that they seem less like first attempts and more like reconstructions of older models preserved in memory. Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, and others appear not as haphazard settlements, but as organized expressions of an inherited blueprint. Their streets, temples, canals, and administrative centers align with a sophistication that surprises even the most seasoned archaeologists. These early cities give no impression of improvisation. Instead, they feel like echoes, faint, yet resolute, of urban landscapes that may have once stood along coastlines, now drowned beneath the shifting waters of the post-Ice Age world. And as we walk through these ancient streets in our imagination, we recognize that Sumer's architecture carries the imprint of a civilization resurrecting itself from memory rather than creating itself anew. Eridu, often called the first city, provides a telling example. Its earliest temple layers reveal repeated reconstruction atop the same sacred foundation, each version more refined than the last, as though the builders were attempting to replicate a structure once known intimately but now recalled only in fragments. The successive layers form a timeline of persistence, a determination to preserve something old within something new. This ritual rebuilding resembles cultural reenactment, a symbolic attempt to anchor a displaced people to a memory of origins that predates their arrival in Mesopotamia. The Temple of Enki, associated with wisdom and the sweet waters of creation, stands at the center of this tradition. It is easy to imagine that those who built it were not inventing a sacred space, but resurrecting one from a homeland swallowed by rising seas. Uruk, by contrast, stands as a proclamation of urban mastery. Its monumental architecture unfolds across a vast landscape of temples, walls, workshops, and administrative quarters that reflect a complex social order. The Iana precinct, dedicated to Inanna, displays innovations in construction and spatial organization that appear too advanced for a civilization supposedly just discovering the possibilities of city life. The White Temple, raised upon a high terrace, hints at architectural traditions that may have existed long before Sumer, traditions refined in cities erased from the archaeological record. The precision of its orientation, the sophistication of its mud brick engineering, and the symbolic geometry embedded within its foundation point toward a lineage of builders who remembered techniques lost to the flood. Uruk does not emerge from experimentation. It emerges from confidence, a city built by people certain of what a city should be. The ziggurats that punctuate the Mesopotamian horizon add another dimension to this mystery. Their stepped forms rise like mountains crafted by human hands, anchoring the spiritual and administrative life of each city. These structures served as centers of ritual, astronomy, governance, and cultural identity. Their design reflects a mathematical precision aligned with celestial cycles, suggesting that the builders carried forward architectural traditions grounded in astronomical observation. The ziggurat is not merely a temple, it is a memory carved into earth and brick. Its tiers echo cosmologies older than the written myths that later describe them. Some scholars argue that the earliest prototypes of these stepped temples might have been built in regions now submerged, their monumental silhouettes lost beneath the waters that transformed the world at the end of the Ice Age. If so, the ziggurats of Sumer represent an act of cultural remembrance, an attempt to restore on land what was once constructed by ancestors, now forgotten. Urban planning in Sumer also reveals patterns too complex to represent humanity's first attempt at city life. The layout of districts, the integration of water channels, and the distribution of public and private spaces reflect an understanding of civic design that appears inherited rather than discovered. Canals were not simply dug. They were engineered with an awareness of flow dynamics that hints at generations of hydrological expertise. Streets were oriented with a logic that balanced trade, defense, administration, and ritual. Warehouses, granaries, and workshops were placed in patterns suggesting a deep familiarity with logistics and resource management. These features coalesce into a portrait of a society rebuilding what it already knew, guided by leaders who carried memories of how cities should function. Even the materials used in construction hint at an older heritage. The Sumerians worked with mud brick not as a novelty, but as a refined medium. They understood its strengths, weaknesses, and long-term behavior. They created molds, standardized dimensions, and developed firing techniques that reveal a mature tradition rather than a nascent craft. Their decorative clay cones arranged in geometric mosaics suggest symbolic language with roots that may extend far beyond the borders of their historical footprint. These artistic choices could reflect motifs carried from older, vanished cultures whose expressions now linger only through these subtle, enduring patterns. The mythic narratives surrounding urban foundations also support the notion of inherited memory. The Sumerians believed that their cities were established under divine instruction, their plans dictated by gods who descended to assign roles, boundaries, and sacred spaces. But when viewed through the lens of historical reinterpretation, these myths resemble encoded recollections of leaders who guided the reconstruction of cities after the flood. The descent of the gods becomes the arrival of survivors. Their instructions become the rebuilding of urban centers based on memories of a time before devastation. The architectural precision of these cities thus becomes a silent testament to a deeper story, one not fully preserved in historical records, yet faintly visible through the physical forms left behind. In this context, architecture becomes a medium of remembrance. Each wall, terrace, and canal carries the imprint of knowledge salvaged from the brink of oblivion. Each temple reflects not invention, but revival, a careful rearticulation of traditions carried by migrants who refuse to let their heritage vanish. Sumer's cities become living palimpsests, layers of memory and innovation intertwined. And as these cities grew, they became repositories for texts, rituals, and symbols, serving as guardians of a past that could not be fully spoken, yet could not be forgotten. This leads us inevitably toward the heart of Sumerian civilization, its libraries and archives, the places where memory solidified into clay. For in those quiet rooms where scribes pressed reed into wet tablets, something extraordinary was happening. They were not only recording their present, they were attempting to rescue the remnants of a world that had slipped beneath the waters of prehistory. The next chapter guides us into those archives, where the recovery of knowledge becomes the central act of a civilization determined not to let the past die a second time. The libraries of Sumer emerge as sanctuaries of memory, the quiet heartbeats of cities striving to preserve a fragile inheritance. Within their walls, scribes bent over wet clay, pressing the sharp tips of reeds into tablets that would harden into the most enduring documents of antiquity. These rooms, often tucked behind temple complexes or administrative centers, held more than economic ledgers or ritual instructions. They served as repositories for myths, king lists, astronomical observations, medical knowledge, and fragments of far older traditions carried across generations. In places like Nippur and later Nineveh, these archives became the closest humanity came to building arks for knowledge, vessels designed to carry forward the remnants of a world already fading behind them. And the sheer scale of these collections, even in their earliest forms, hints at a civilizational urgency born from loss. Nippur stands out as one of the earliest and most sacred of these centers. The Temple of Enlil functioned not only as a spiritual nexus, but as a scholastic one, where scribes compiled hymns, epics, omens, and cosmological treatises. This was not the behavior of a civilization discovering writing. It was the behavior of a culture determined to recover, consolidate, and protect intellectual fragments at risk of vanishing forever. The scribes of Nippur did not write to create novelty. They wrote to preserve continuity. They were, in a sense, the first archivists of humanity's forgotten epics, aware that their tablets were lifelines stretched across the abyss left by the flood. The reverence with which they handled their work suggests that they perceived the stakes. Knowledge must not be lost again. Centuries later, Nineveh's great library under Ashurbanipal would echo this tradition with staggering ambition, collecting not only contemporary texts, but ancient Sumerian works that had already become relics. The king boasted of understanding writings from before the flood, a statement often dismissed as exaggeration, but which, in light of Sumer's own flood narratives, may reflect genuine belief that the texts in his possession preserved memories older than the cities of Mesopotamia. That these works survived into his era indicates a continuous line of transmission stretching back millennia, a chain of scribes who copied and recopied brittle clay fragments so the knowledge they carried would not crumble into dust. Such devotion marks more than cultural pride. It marks a civilizational trauma echoing through time, the deep awareness that whole worlds can disappear if not safeguarded. The organization of these archives also reveals an advanced approach to knowledge management. Tablets were categorized by subject, medical texts with medical texts, incantations with incantations, star lists with star lists, reflecting a system of classification unlikely to emerge spontaneously in a first-generation literate society. Instead, it suggests the continuation of an older intellectual tradition, one in which information had long been organized into coherent bodies. The inhabitants of Sumer were not inventing scholarship, they were rebuilding it. Their libraries bear the faint architecture of an educational system inherited from a vanished world, its structure adapted to new realities, but its spirit unmistakably ancient. One of the most revealing elements of these libraries is the content that appears deliberately preserved, even when its purpose is no longer fully understood. Incantations referencing forgotten deities, rituals describing cosmologies no longer practiced, star lists whose precision exceeds the needs of early agrarian society. All these point to a people transcribing memories they themselves did not always grasp. This act of preservation for its own sake is unusual. It implies an awareness that the past contained secrets or wisdom that might one day matter again, even if their meaning had grown dim. It is the behavior of survivors who witnessed profound loss and refused to let their remaining fragments slip away. The epics themselves underscore this theme of remembrance. Works like the Epic of Gilgamesh, though shaped by poetic evolution, contain layers of narrative that point toward an older tradition. The flood story embedded within it predates the poem by centuries, its details aligning with the Sumerian account of Ziusudra. Such continuity indicates that the scribes were not inventing mythology anew, but working with inherited stories, remnants of ancestral memory translated into the language of their time. The libraries then become both conservatories and translators of a past too fractured to reconstruct fully, but too important to abandon. Moreover, the sheer volume of administrative records suggests a disciplined effort to rebuild order after chaos. Tablets track grain distribution, land ownership, temple offerings, trade routes, labor allocations, and legal disputes. This intense documentation resembles the efforts of a society determined to avoid repeating the disintegration experienced by their predecessors. Writing becomes a tool of stability, a means of preventing the collapse that follows when knowledge is held only in memory. The libraries stabilize civilization itself, countering the fragility exposed by whatever catastrophe ended the world before Sumer. But perhaps the most telling element is the emotional tone that lingers within the texts. A subtle undercurrent of longing permeates the hymns, laments, and creation stories. Again and again, the scribes speak of lost ages, of divine instruction withdrawn, of cities destroyed and built anew. This narrative repetition suggests that the trauma of the flood, or of multiple catastrophes, was not a distant myth, but a lived inheritance. The libraries become the collective attempt to hold on to a world slipping further from reach with each generation. In this light, the archives of Sumer are more than repositories of clay tablets. They are monuments to survival. They are the intellectual shelters of a civilization rebuilding itself from faint memory. And as we step from these quiet rooms into the broader expanse of ancient history, we encounter a site that predates even Sumer, one that offers a bridge between the world before the flood and the world after it. a site whose stones whisper of a continuity too vast to ignore, guiding us toward the next revelation in this unfolding tale. Göbekli Tepe and the shadowed prehistory that binds it to Sumer's rebirth. Göbekli Tepe rises from the hills of southeastern Anatolia like a question carved in stone, its massive pillars circling through time with an authority that predates not only Sumer, but every known city, temple, or settled culture. Built more than 6,000 years before the first Sumerian cities took form, it confounds the assumption that complex architecture must follow agriculture, writing, or urban planning. Instead, it stands as a testament to a symbolic and organizational sophistication that should not exist in a world still recovering from the Ice Age. Its circles of T-shaped monoliths, adorned with animals and abstract forms, suggest that someone, long before recorded history, possessed the vision, knowledge, and communal structure required to build monuments of sublime scale. Göbekli Tepe feels less like the beginning of something and more like the echo of something older, a cultural remnant persisted through the shadows of a forgotten world. When we view Göbekli Tepe through the lens of Sumer's sudden brilliance, the parallels become too striking to ignore. Both civilizations exhibit symbolic systems that appear fully formed, both display architectural traditions that seem inherited rather than invented, and both emerge from the aftermath of a world shaken by climatic upheaval. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers, according to conventional timelines, yet they organized labor forces large enough to move stones weighing many tons. They carved iconography that reflects deep mythological memory, perhaps tracing back to stories born in landscapes erased by rising seas. Their craftsmanship implies a continuity of artistic and symbolic traditions spanning generations, hinting at a cultural lineage that predates agriculture itself. If a lost civilization existed before the flood, Göbekli Tepe may hold the faint imprint of its final descendants. The symbolic motifs carved into its pillars resonate with Sumerian imagery in ways that defy coincidence. Serpents, birds, lions, scorpions, and abstract symbols echo motifs found later in Mesopotamian seals and temple art. The recurrence of these symbols across millennia suggests not direct inheritance, but the survival of a shared mythic vocabulary, one preserved through the turbulent centuries that separated the end of the Ice Age from the rise of Sumer. It is as though both cultures drew from a deeper reservoir of memory, a symbolic cosmology that endured even after its originating context had vanished beneath shifting climates and rising waters. Göbekli Tepe may represent the ceremonial heart of communities attempting to preserve these symbols, encoding stories too ancient to retain in language alone. Archaeologists have noted that Göbekli Tepe's builders deliberately buried their monumental enclosures, an act as mysterious as the site itself. This burial preserved the structures for 12,000 years, shielding them from erosion and destruction. But why would a culture invest such immense effort into creating a sanctuary of stone only to entomb it? One possibility is that they were preserving it intentionally, attempting to safeguard a sacred memory as their world changed irreversibly. Climate shifts at the end of the Pleistocene forced migrations, altered ecosystems, and transformed landscapes. Communities that once flourished along rich coastlines may have moved inland, bringing with them fragments of former traditions. In burying Göbekli Tepe, they may have been burying the last physical link to a world rapidly slipping into myth, a world whose symbolic vocabulary would later resurface in the foundational myths of Sumer. The architectural layout of Göbekli Tepe also offers intriguing hints at continuity. Its circular enclosures, centered around twin pillars, may reflect cosmological models of duality and celestial alignment. The pillars themselves, with their anthropomorphic shapes, hint at beings regarded as intermediaries between humans and the divine. Later, Sumerian tradition echoes this structure. Twin deities governing dual realms, central temples aligned to the rising sun or specific stars, and ritual precincts designed to map the heavens onto the earth. These parallels may be coincidental, yet when placed alongside Sumer's unexpected sophistication, they weave a narrative suggesting that the symbolic and architectural traditions of the ancient Near East did not begin with Sumer. They reawakened in Sumer. Even the labor organization behind Göbekli Tepe suggests a proto-urban mindset. Coordinated construction of such magnitude requires leadership, planning, logistics, and a shared cultural purpose strong enough to mobilize groups across seasons. This complexity should belong to settled city-states, not nomadic bands. Yet here it stands, thousands of years before the world's first officially recognized cities. This anomaly mirrors the puzzle of Sumer, a level of social organization emerging prematurely, as though both cultures inherited traditions forged in a lost age of structured communities. But perhaps the most revealing connection lies in the continuity of narrative themes. Göbekli Tepe's iconography speaks of animals, cycles, death, and transformation. Sumer's earliest myths also speak of cosmic order emerging from primordial chaos, of beings who mediated between worlds, of knowledge carried across boundaries of destruction and rebirth. These recurring themes hint at a shared cultural memory, stretching back to humanity's earliest symbolic expressions. If a pre-flood civilization once existed, Göbekli Tepe could be its last ceremonial echo, while Sumer could be its intellectual rebirth. Seen from this perspective, the transition from Göbekli Tepe to Sumer is not a leap, but a bridge across millennia of loss and adaptation. The former represents the twilight of an ancient symbolic tradition. The latter represents its rekindling in a world newly reshaped. The symbolic vocabulary carved into stone at Göbekli Tepe may have persisted through oral memory, ritual practice, and fragmented cultural transmission until it found new expression in the temples and myths of Sumer. The architectural confidence of Sumer may thus reflect echoes of knowledge honed long before its cities rose from the alluvial plain. As we follow this thread, the narrative deepens. The presence of trauma becomes undeniable, a sense of something precious lost, something the early builders of civilization were desperately trying to preserve. And as we turn toward Sumer's epic literature and king lists, this theme becomes unavoidable. The scribes did not merely record history, they mourned it. They remembered a world washed away, a lineage broken, a knowledge scattered. Their texts do not simply describe origins, they grieve them, and this grief becomes the doorway into the next chapter of our unfolding journey, the trauma of loss that shaped the mission of the survivors who rebuilt civilization after the flood. The shadow of loss stretches across Sumerian memory, like a veil the scribes could never fully lift. Beneath the precision of their records and the structure of their myths lies a quieter, more fragile truth. They were a people still grieving. Their earliest stories pulse with the ache of something irretrievably broken, a sense that the world they inhabited was only a pale reflection of one that came before. This undertone appears not in isolated passages, but throughout their literature, their rituals, their laments. It is as if the survivors who formed the nuclei of Sumerian culture carried within them a wound inherited from ancestors who had witnessed the drowning of their world. This wound shaped not only their narratives, but their mission, to preserve whatever remained, to rebuild what could be rebuilt, and to ensure that the knowledge carried through the flood did not vanish completely. This trauma becomes visible first in the Sumerian lamentations, poems that mourn cities destroyed by war or disaster. Yet beneath their immediate context lies an older sorrow. The tone is too deep, too existential, as though the poets were channeling a grief older than any single city's fall. They speak of gods abandoning their temples, of waters rising without mercy, of humanity cast into confusion. These laments echo the structure of flood narratives, suggesting that the memory of the great cataclysm was never far from the cultural consciousness. Even when describing local events, the scribes seemed to reach instinctively toward that primal trauma. as though all destruction were a reenactment of the one that had shattered the world long before. The myth of the flood itself appears not as an isolated tale, but as a cornerstone of their worldview. It marks the dividing line between eras, the rupture that reshaped humanity's fate. The story of Ziusudra, later Utnapishtim, depicts a man chosen to preserve life and knowledge from a disaster that threatened to erase everything. But embedded within the story is a subtle implication. The catastrophe did not come as a surprise. The instructions to build the vessel, the emphasis on preserving not only animals, but the seeds of civilization, and the solemn warnings against forgetting all suggest that the survivors already understood the stakes. They knew that if knowledge died, civilization would die with it. This is the mindset of a people whose ancestors had watched their world collapse and had resolved never to face such darkness unprepared again. Evidence of this determination appears in the Sumerian obsession with record-keeping. Their tablets do more than document transactions or rituals. They reveal a deeper compulsion to write, to inscribe, to anchor memory in clay. The sheer volume of early texts exceeds what would be necessary for practical administration. Instead, it reflects a cultural instinct to preserve. Writing becomes the antidote to oblivion, the tool through which knowledge is rescued from the fragility of oral transmission. The scribes, in this sense, were heirs to the trauma of forgetting, guardians determined to ensure that the wisdom carried from the drowned world did not fade. Each tablet, however mundane, becomes part of a larger mission, to hold the past together long enough for the future to understand it. This mission appears even more clearly in their epic literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, despite its heroic veneer, is fundamentally a story about grief and the search for meaning after catastrophic loss. Gilgamesh's quest for immortality mirrors humanity's attempt to confront the transience exposed by the flood. He journeys to the ends of the earth seeking Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who has witnessed the destruction of the old world. Their encounter becomes a symbolic bridge between the present and the deep past, between the rebuilding and the remembering. Utnapishtim recounts the Great Deluge not as myth, but as memory, anchoring the epic in a lineage of trauma carried forward through generations. Gilgamesh's failure to attain immortality reflects the broader human condition. Knowledge and memory are the true inheritance, not eternal life. Even the structure of Sumerian religion reveals the imprint of this inherited loss. The gods are not omnipotent beings dwelling in distant perfection. They are figures who experience regret, fear, and grief. In the flood myth, they weep as the waters rise. They mourn the destruction they themselves allowed. This anthropomorphic vulnerability suggests that these deities emerged from memories of leaders or ancestors who endured the catastrophe. Their emotional responses reflect the sorrow of real individuals whose world vanished beneath rising seas. Over time, their human traits became mythologized, but the core of their stories remained anchored in lived experience. The gods of Sumer, therefore, may be the transformed memories of those who once guided the survivors through the aftermath of the flood, figures whose grief became divine narrative. The trauma also manifests in the symbolic themes of rebirth and restoration that permeate Sumerian cosmology. Temples are rebuilt repeatedly atop older foundations, echoing the cycle of destruction and renewal. Myths describe the reordering of the world from chaos, mirroring the efforts of post-flood communities to reclaim stability. The agricultural rituals tied to the dying and rising of vegetation resonate not only with seasonal cycles, but with the deeper rhythm of civilizational collapse and revival. These themes suggest that the Sumerians did not simply remember the flood, they lived in its shadow. They saw their civilization as part of a long continuum of loss and recovery, and their rituals became acts of collective healing. Within this framework, the survivors of the pre-flood world take on a new role. They become not only founders but protectors, charged with passing on the fragments of knowledge salvaged from the deluge. Their descendants, the early Sumerians, inherited this sense of responsibility. It is reflected in the meticulous copying of texts, the preservation of rituals whose meanings had grown obscure, and the construction of cities aligned with ancient cosmic principles. These actions reveal a culture deeply aware that knowledge must be safeguarded against the cycles of destruction inherent in nature and history. Yet the trauma of loss is not only cultural, it is personal. Many early Sumerian myths describe beings or humans searching for what was taken from them, a homeland engulfed by waters, a harmony broken by divine wrath, a past remembered only through fragments. This persistent longing suggests that the memory of a lost world continued to resonate through the generations, shaping the emotional landscape of the civilization. It is as though the survivors whispered their stories to their children, who whispered them to theirs, until those whispers became the foundation of myth, literature, and ritual. And now, with this understanding, we approach one of the most enigmatic artifacts of Sumerian memory, the Sumerian king list, a document that claims to preserve the names of rulers not only after the flood but before it, spanning epochs so vast that they challenge every known timeline. Whether literal or symbolic, these reigns point toward a past the Sumerians believed was real, a past their ancestors may have lived through, a past whose memory refused to die. The Sumerian king list stands like a monolith in the landscape of ancient texts, a document so audacious in its scope that it blurs the boundary between myth and memory. Inscribed on clay with the same calm precision used for taxes and temple accounts, it asserts that kingship existed long before the flood and that rulers of unfathomable longevity governed cities now lost to time. These pre-flood kings reigned for tens of thousands of years, their lifespans stretching across epochs in a way that confounds literal interpretation. Yet dismissing the list as fantasy overlooks the deeper truth it may encode. For if we read it not as biography but as chronology, not as individuals but as eras, then the king list becomes a rare window into a forgotten expanse of prehistory, a memory of structured society long before the earliest cities we can excavate. The document begins with a striking declaration. After kingship descended from the heavens, it was in Eridu. This is not simply a theological flourish. It reflects the belief that authority, order, and civilization were bestowed upon humanity from a source older than the world they knew. If we interpret the heavens as a metaphor for a previous vanished highland or coastal civilization, one that seemed elevated or unreachable after rising seas reshaped the geography, the descent of kingship becomes a poetic memory of survivors arriving with knowledge of governance. The earliest reigns listed may represent distinct phases of cultural continuity carried from regions now underwater. Each king could symbolize a lineage, a tradition, or an institutional era stretching across generations in a stable environment that existed prior to the upheaval of the flood. The extraordinary lengths of these reigns, often thousands of years, fit more comfortably within this symbolic framework. They point not to immortal rulers, but to long-lasting periods of relative stability, perhaps in a civilization that thrived for millennia before climatic catastrophe forced its migration. Such durations mirror geological cycles and cultural epochs rather than human lifespans. When the king list shifts abruptly after the flood, shortening reigns to human scales, the contrast becomes meaningful. It marks the collapse of the old world and the fragmentary rebirth of its successor. The exaggerated time spans may be the only way the scribes knew to express the immensity of the lost era, a span of history too vast to measure through the lens of their own lifetimes. Interestingly, the king list also records places that archaeology can only partially verify, and others that have left no trace at all. Cities such as Eridu and Shuruppak appear both in myth and excavation, their histories reaching deeper than expected. Other cities, like Larak and Menluana's seat, or the enigmatic Bad Tibira, remain elusive, perhaps because their earliest layers lie beneath sediments or were situated along coastlines now submerged. If their origins predate the flood, their remains may rest under the waters of the Persian Gulf or beneath river sediments deposited over thousands of years. The king list thus reads like a map of both remembered and forgotten geography, tracing the contours of a world that shifted violently when sea levels rose. In the transition from pre-flood to post-flood kings, another pattern emerges. The list suggests that knowledge survived the cataclysm, but authority did not. Kingship had to descend again, implying that surviving groups were scattered, disorganized, and forced to rebuild political structures from scratch. This forced reorganization echoes the trauma explored in earlier chapters. The collapse of a civilization whose institutional memory survived only in fragments. The king list becomes a kind of mourning document, an attempt to outline continuity where continuity had been shattered. It reflects a longing to connect the present to a distant past the scribes could feel but not fully reconstruct. Even the structure of the king list, with its linear arrangement of rulers, may hide a more complex truth. Pre-literate cultures often compress collective memory into simplified genealogies, reducing entire eras into lineages or attributing innovations to single legendary figures. What appears as a list of kings might actually encode dynastic traditions, cultural phases, or long-standing ancestral groups. The hyperbolic reign lengths could represent periods of prosperity or stability within a pre-flood civilization that maintained order across many generations. In this reading, the king list becomes not a historical record of individuals, but a condensed timeline of an entire lost world. The flood itself becomes the transition point, the dividing line the Sumerians recognized as the end of an earlier age. After the deluge, rains shrink dramatically, reflecting shorter, more volatile historical conditions. This stark contrast reinforces the idea that something enormous was lost: technologies, institutions, cosmologies, and that the survivors spent centuries attempting to rebuild. The early post-flood rulers preside over cities still finding their footing, cities echoing the shapes of forgotten predecessors through incomplete memory. The king list captures this instability, presenting reigns that fluctuate in length and regions that rise and fall with unusual rapidity. It reads like the chronicle of a civilization reassembling itself from scattered fragments. The presence of antediluvian kings in later traditions, for example, the biblical patriarchs with long lifespans, may reflect the same impulse to encode vast prehistoric epochs into simplified genealogies. This cross-cultural resonance suggests that the memory of a long pre-flood era was widespread, not confined to Sumer alone. The shared motif of elongated lifespans could represent a common underlying memory of timescales that exceeded ordinary human understanding. It hints at a shared trauma, a shared break in continuity, and perhaps a shared awareness that history extended far beyond the surviving records. Thus, the king list becomes more than an ancient curiosity. It becomes a blueprint of forgotten time, a symbolic ledger of a civilization erased from the earth but preserved in the minds of those who inherited its ashes. Its exaggerated reigns are not exaggerations of people, they are distortions of memory, trying to grasp the immensity of what was lost. Its cities may be the last linguistic echoes of metropolises swallowed by rising seas. Its structure reflects the tension between remembering and forgetting. And as we move forward, the next layer of this mystery unfolds through the mythic portrayal of the beings who guided early humanity, the supposed gods who descended from the sky, whose arrival marked the beginning of kingship, order, and civilization. But what if these divine figures were not celestial beings, but the final custodians of the world recorded in the king list? The figures who descended from the sky in Sumerian lore have long invited speculation, yet when viewed through the lens of survival rather than divinity, their stories take on a startling coherence. Enki, Enlil, Inanna, these names echo across millennia as gods of creation, law, love, war, and cosmic order. But beneath their divine veneers lies a more human narrative, one shaped by displacement, authority, memory, and the struggle to rebuild after catastrophe. In this reinterpretation, these beings did not descend from the heavens in a literal sense. They arrived from a metaphorical height, a once thriving civilization destroyed so thoroughly that it became unreachable, its remnants appearing divine to those who had never known such complexity. The language of the myth retains the reverence of that encounter, describing leaders as gods, because the survivors who carried knowledge forward existed on a different plane of understanding than the populations they encountered. If we imagine elite survivors emerging from high ground or coastal refugia after the flood, their arrival in Mesopotamia would indeed seem like a descent from the heavens. To communities struggling through the early stages of resettlement, these individuals, armed with inherited knowledge of agriculture, construction, astronomy, and governance, would possess abilities bordering on the miraculous. Their instructions would shape the foundations of society. Their memories of the lost world would form the core of new myths. Their conflicts would be magnified into cosmic dramas. Over generations, these leaders would be mythologized not out of deceit, but out of awe. Their extraordinary knowledge, born from a lineage stretching back into pre-flood civilization, would raise them to a status that later scribes could only describe as divine. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, emerges as one of the most human of these figures. His myths portray him as a mediator, a builder, a strategist, traits consistent with a leader guiding reconstruction. He organizes canals, establishes boundaries, and distributes knowledge. He advises humanity, protects them during the flood, and helps shape institutions essential to survival. Nothing in his portrayal suggests omnipotence. Instead, he resembles a custodian of knowledge, a figure struggling to preserve fragments of a shattered world. His domain, the subterranean waters known as the Abzu, may symbolize the deep memory from which he draws his wisdom, the cultural reservoir of a drowned civilization encoded in mythic form. Enlil, by contrast, embodies authority and control. His myths depict him as stern, decisive, and demanding order. He establishes boundaries for cities, commands the winds, and enforces laws. In administrative terms, he reflects the role of a chief organizer or ruler, tasked with stabilizing society after chaos. His conflicts with Enki mirror tensions that would naturally arise among surviving elites attempting to reorganize their people in a drastically transformed landscape. These tensions, magnified through centuries of storytelling, become divine disputes, while their underlying political and philosophical disagreements reflect real struggles among the survivors of a world-ending catastrophe. Inanna, radiant and fierce, carries the profile of a charismatic leader whose influence extends across city-states. Her myths portray her as ambitious, adaptive, and deeply involved in the mechanisms of power. She negotiates with other deities, acquires the sacred me, representing civilization's core disciplines, and plays pivotal roles in war, kingship, and social transformation. These narratives align with the memory of a historical figure or lineage that wielded significant political and cultural authority. Her association with Venus reinforces her connection to astronomical traditions inherited from earlier epochs. She is not a goddess of abstract space. She is the personification of knowledge tied to celestial behavior, suggesting a continuity between pre-flood sky-watching traditions and Sumerian institutions. Even the stories of divine councils reflect the governance structures of a pre-flood society whose complexities the Sumerians preserved through myth. Councils of gods debating laws, distribution of land, and responses to crises mirror administrative councils of a highly organized civilization. These institutions did not emerge emerge spontaneously in Sumer, they reflect inherited traditions adapted to a new world. The mythic narrative encodes political behavior so intricate that it exceeds what we would expect from humanity's earliest cities. It appears instead as a cultural memory of earlier societal frameworks reinterpreted through theological symbolism. The myth of divine descent gains further clarity when we consider the geographical language used in the tablets. The gods descend to specific locations, arriving from distant or elevated realms. They establish rule in cities that appear abruptly with near-complete administrative systems. They bring with them knowledge that should have taken centuries to develop. These narrative patterns align not with supernatural beings, but with migrating elites carrying institutional memory into newly forming settlements. Their presence catalyzes the emergence of Sumerian civilization. Their absence in later eras marks the fading of direct ancestral memory, leaving behind rituals and stories that attempt to preserve their legacy. Even the divine conflicts echo human struggles. The rivalry between Enlil and Enki may reflect ideological divisions over how to rebuild after the cataclysm. The tensions between Inanna and the older gods may symbolize generational shifts as new leaders emerged to replace those tied to the pre-flood world. These myths are not merely metaphors. They are the cultural processing of real historical pressures. Over time, their human origins were obscured, but their emotional truth remains embedded in the stories. Interpreting these gods as survivors reframes the meaning of kingship descending from the heavens. It becomes the moment when leadership and knowledge from the lost world entered the reborn one. The gods become the last architects of an older civilization, guiding the first architects of the new. Their buildings, rituals, laws, and cosmologies represent not divine creation, but the last echoes of a tradition damaged by disaster. And this reinterpretation aligns seamlessly with the abrupt sophistication of Sumerian society. If these figures carried the remnants of a forgotten world, then their mythic portrayals are cultural monuments preserving their memory, monuments carved not of stone, but of narrative and reverence. Yet the legacy of these beings extends beyond their mythic personas. They left behind not only institutions, but a system of knowledge transmission that shaped the entire trajectory of Mesopotamian civilization. Their influence can be seen in the educational structures, the scribal traditions, and the priestly hierarchies that emerged in the centuries following Sumer's rise. And as we continue our journey, we move from the mythic to the intellectual, from the gods as memory to the knowledge they carried. For in the heart of Sumer lies something even more remarkable, a deliberate attempt to encode and preserve the pre-flood world's intellectual heritage, ensuring that its wisdom would survive long after its cities were lost. The transmission of knowledge in Sumer unfolds like a carefully orchestrated ritual, a thread woven deliberately through temples, schools, and priestly lineages. It is here, in the quiet endurance of instruction, that the influence of the so-called gods becomes most tangible. If these beings were the last guardians of a civilization erased by cataclysm, then their greatest achievement was not the founding of cities or the construction of temples, but the preservation of ideas carried across the boundary between worlds. The Sumerians themselves believed that the sacred me, the divine decrees governing the structures of civilization, were bestowed upon humanity by the gods. Yet when we strip away the mythic language, what remains is the image of a knowledge system transmitted intentionally, preserved through reverence, encoded in ritual and scholarship so it could survive the instability of the post-flood world. The me are described as gifts of extraordinary breadth: kingship, craftsmanship, writing, wisdom, truth, weaving, music, justice, warfare, and the arts of temple construction. They read like an inventory of cultural technologies, the cumulative achievements of an older civilization distilled into symbolic form. Myths depict Inanna carrying them in a boat from Eridu, a city revered as the first settlement after the flood. In historical terms, this could reflect the migration of knowledge from one community to another, the movement of elites or specialists who bore the fragments of pre-flood expertise. The story's ritual tone suggests the weight of what was being transferred. This was not casual teaching. It was the preservation of a civilization's essence, conveyed through myth, because myth alone could carry meaning that ordinary language could not yet contain. Sumerian education mirrored this sacred transmission. The Aduba, the tablet house, was not merely a school, but a sanctified institution where scribes learned the skills needed to preserve the collective memory. Students copied proverbs, mathematical problems, administrative texts, hymns, and myths with a precision that indicates a lineage of teaching stretching far beyond the invention of writing. Their curriculum reflected a world that had already lost much and understood that survival depended on controlling and safeguarding the fragments that remained. The temple complexes served as intellectual centers not because priests sought power, but because they bore the responsibility of maintaining continuity in a world still recovering from collapse. The priests were the inheritors of the gods' knowledge, or rather, the inheritors of the ancestors' teachings, reframed as divine law. Within these institutions, astronomy and mathematics were treated not as mere curiosities, but as sacred disciplines. Knowledge of celestial cycles was crucial for agricultural timing, ritual observances, and the broader cosmic worldview through which Sumerians interpreted their place in the universe. This reverence suggests that the survivors of the pre-flood world may have regarded astronomy as a pillar of their lost civilization. If their origins lay in coastal regions deeply connected to maritime navigation or long-standing observational traditions, then celestial knowledge would have been essential. Its preservation in Sumer reflects a conscious effort to maintain the intellectual heart of a vanished society. The myths describe the gods as architects of the heavens, but perhaps they were simply the last teachers capable of explaining the sky. Similarly, the Sumerian mastery of measurement, of time, space, grain, labor, and land reveals a system too coherent to have developed piecemeal. Their numerical tables show a lineage of teaching where methods were not discovered but inherited, passed down with unwavering fidelity. Such continuity suggests that those who founded Sumer's schools were not starting from scratch. They were reconstructing a framework whose deeper origins had been obscured by the trauma of the flood. The precision of their metrology, their awareness of geometric and administrative needs, and their use of standardized weights all point toward a tradition older than the urban society that employed it. The knowledge preserved in these systems carried the silent signature of an earlier world. Religious rituals also served as vessels of transmission. Within ceremonies honoring Enki, Enlil, Inanna, and other deities, symbolic reenactments of creation, destruction, and restoration were performed with rhythms suggesting cultural memory. These rituals, often codified in liturgical texts, may have preserved fragments of pre-flood worldview too subtle to survive in prose. The mythic motifs, divine councils, cosmic ordering, cycles of death and rebirth, could reflect the experiences of survivors, translating the collapse and reconstruction of their world into narrative form. Ritual became a coded language through which difficult memories could be conveyed without breaking the fragile psyche of communities rebuilding themselves. Even architectural traditions functioned as channels of knowledge transmission. Ziggurats, temples, and city layouts reveal a continuity of design principles that may have originated long before Sumer. The very act of rebuilding structures on the same mound over generations suggests a deliberate attempt to preserve spatial memory. Each new layer of construction symbolized reconnection with an ancestral past. The orientation of temples toward celestial alignments indicates not only astronomical awareness, but the desire to maintain harmony with cosmic patterns once central to pre-flood life. The gods did not require these alignments. The survivors did. They were rebuilding not merely physical structures, but an entire cosmological framework. In this light, the pantheon itself itself becomes a pedagogical tool. Each deity embodies an aspect of inherited knowledge. Enki represents the preservation of wisdom and technical mastery. Enlil embodies order, governance, and the stabilization of society. Inanna carries with her the dynamic forces of innovation, diplomacy, and conflict inherent in rebuilding a fragmented world. These roles feel less like divine archetypes and more like distilled memories of ancestral factions or institutions. Over generations, myths transformed these memories into sacred narratives, ensuring that even when their literal origins were forgotten, their symbolic importance remained intact. The process of transmission was not seamless. Gaps appear in the mythic and scholarly record, places where knowledge seems truncated, where rituals lack explanation, where symbols persist long after their meanings have grown obscure. These gaps reveal the broken lineage of a world that did not survive intact. Yet the very presence of these fragments proves that the Sumerians were reaching back across the chasm of the flood, attempting to reconstruct a legacy whose full contours they could no longer see. Their civilization becomes a mosaic of inheritance, each piece carrying the weight of a memory, too ancient to revive completely, but too essential to abandon. This brings us to the next layer of the mystery, the sky itself. For among the fragments the Sumerians preserved, none stands out more vividly than their awareness of celestial cycles whose timescales far exceed the needs of agricultural society. Their myths, their mathematics, and their architecture all hint at a deeper understanding of cosmic rhythms, particularly those cycles whose origins point not to the rebirth of civilization after the flood, but to a far older tradition that must have existed before it. The sky turns again toward us as a custodian of forgotten epochs, carrying in its slow, inexorable movements the faint fingerprints of those who watched it long before history began. Among the celestial rhythms the Sumerians preserved, none is more striking than their awareness of cycles that unfold over spans far exceeding the lifetime of any single city, kingdom, or even civilization. These cycles, subtle, majestic, and nearly imperceptible without centuries of observation, suggest that the astronomical knowledge woven into Sumerian tradition did not originate in Mesopotamia. Instead, it appears to be the inheritance of a people who carried with them the memory of a sky no longer aligned with the horizon of their new world. Among these celestial mysteries, the slow wobble of the earth known as precession stands as the most profound, hinting at a scientific legacy that cannot be explained by the circumstances of Sumer's emergence. Precession is a cycle of approximately 26,000 years, during which the orientation of Earth's axis traces a grand circle across the sky. Stars rise and set in different positions across the ages. Constellations shift their dominion over the solstices and equinoxes, and the celestial pole itself wanders across distant regions of the night. No young civilization, rebuilding itself from the trauma of a global flood, could have discovered this nearly invisible drift through its own limited observations. Knowledge of precession demands the continuity of a culture that observed the heavens for countless generations, passing down star lore with precision sufficient to detect changes only noticeable over centuries. Yet Sumerian myth and measurement reflect an awareness of long cycles, cosmic epochs, and shifting celestial dominions that resonate eerily with precessional mechanics. Their association of divine ages with specific stars or constellations suggests a worldview framed around celestial transitions. The Sumerian heavens are not merely symbolic, but structured, governed by ordered domains and cyclical epochs. Stories describing the changing fates of gods, the rise and fall of cosmic rulers, and the renewal of the world after great intervals may encode memories of astronomical transitions witnessed by ancestors who lived under different skies. If these tales originated in a pre-flood civilization situated at different latitudes or possessing observatories now lost beneath rising seas, then the sky would indeed have appeared altered after catastrophe. Survivors would have seen familiar constellations displaced, rising at unfamiliar angles, migrating through different seasonal positions. The heavens themselves would confirm the rupture between ages, giving mythic form to scientific memory. The evidence of precessional awareness becomes even more compelling when we examine the Sumerian interest in the cyclical ordering of time. Their division of history into eras governed by specific deities mirrors the notion of cosmic ages. Their use of numerically significant cycles, 60, 120, 360, aligns with astronomical intervals that fit seamlessly into the geometry of precessional motion. Their ziggurats, oriented with methodical attention to cardinal directions, function as terrestrial anchors to celestial observation, offering vantage points from which priests could track the slow drift of sunrise points along the horizon. These alignments do not merely serve ritual purposes. They preserve a tradition of watching the sky with a patience inherited from ancestors who considered celestial rhythms essential to understanding humanity's place in the world. Even more revealing is the role of the gods in regulating cosmic order. Enlil governs the winds and seasons, Enki the deep knowledge of cycles and waters, Nana and Utu the orderly progression of lunar and solar movements. These divine attributes reflect not arbitrary invention, but the integration of astronomical understanding into mythic narrative. The gods become embodiments of forces observed and measured by a culture deeply familiar with celestial patterns. If the earliest Sumerians inherited an advanced astronomical framework, these deities could represent the symbolic preservation of a scientific worldview once articulated in the rational language of a civilization that fell long before Mesopotamia's rise. The planetary associations add another dimension. Inanna's identity as Venus reflects a sophisticated grasp of the planet's complex cycle. Utu's solar role and Nana's lunar domain align with precisely measured periods. These associations would be expected in a mature astronomical tradition, but their presence at the very dawn of recorded history suggests a continuity reaching far deeper than the archaeological record. The Sumerians did not tentatively map the sky. They restored an older map, one whose origins must lie in communities whose monuments and observatories may now rest beneath the waters of vanished coastlines. Precessional hints also appear in the Sumerian fascination with the me, the divine decrees governing cosmic and societal structure. Some scholars interpret these as metaphors for stability, but viewed through the lens of inherited knowledge, they resemble encoded principles designed to maintain harmony with cycles too vast for ordinary timekeeping. If the survivors of a pre-flood civilization understood that astronomical cycles influenced climate patterns, agricultural rhythms, or the rise and fall of civilizations themselves, they might have encoded this awareness into myth and ritual to preserve it across generations. The me become not commandments from the gods, but fragments of cosmological science translated into symbolic form so that it could outlive the collapse of the system that gave birth to it. This cosmic awareness also permeates the Sumerian sense of destiny. Their myths describe ages overseen by different gods, eras shaped by celestial forces that wax and wane. The flood itself becomes part of a cosmic cycle rather than an isolated event. This perspective mirrors traditions found globally: Hindu yugas, Greek ages of man, Maya long counts, suggesting a shared underlying memory of rhythms larger than any single culture. Such widespread parallels indicate that humanity once possessed a more unified cosmological framework, perhaps inherited from a civilization that disseminated its knowledge before its own destruction. If Sumer preserved fragments of this framework, then their astronomical anomalies become testimonies rather than mysteries. Their early knowledge of lunar standstills, their meticulous star lists, their continuity of observational records all point toward a tradition too old to have originated solely in Mesopotamia. The survivors who brought this knowledge may have sought to rebuild the intellectual core of their lost world, re-establishing their relationship with a cosmos that had once guided their daily lives. Thus, the sky becomes a silent collaborator in this narrative, its vast cycles preserving the memory of a civilization that may have endured for millennia before the flood erased its cities. And as we follow this thread into the modern age, we find that researchers, archaeologists, and scholars continue to encounter anomalies, discrepancies between the official timeline and the evidence that refuses to align with it. These mismatches create a modern echo of ancient uncertainty, guiding us toward alternative interpretations that challenge the boundaries of conventional history. Modern researchers approaching the ruins of Sumer often find themselves confronting the same unsettling whispers that echoed through the ancient tablets. Something does not fit. Despite centuries of scholarship, anomalies persist. Disparities between technological sophistication and supposed historical context, abrupt appearances of fully formed systems, and symbolic continuities stretching far beyond the boundaries of recorded time. These puzzles fuel alternative theories that, far from dismissing conventional archaeology, simply attempt to reconcile the gaps it cannot yet explain. And as new discoveries surface from deserts, riverbeds, and beneath the world's seas, the possibility of a forgotten chapter of human history grows more plausible, demanding interpretations that transcend the limitations of current timelines. One of the most striking anomalies is the sudden onset of Sumerian urbanism. No precursor settlements show a gradual evolution toward the complexity displayed in Uruk and Eridu. Instead, archaeology reveals a sharp threshold. Communities transition almost instantly from small villages to monumental cities with social stratification, administrative bureaucracy, religious hierarchy, and technical mastery. This abruptness mirrors patterns observed elsewhere, in Egypt's first dynasty, in the Indus Valley's mature Harappan phase, and in early dynastic China, suggesting that multiple civilizations may have inherited frameworks from a deeper source rather than developing them independently. This recurrence across continents invites the possibility of a shared inheritance, one disseminated by scattered survivors of a global catastrophe whose memory endured in fragments. Another anomaly emerges in the sophistication of Sumerian metallurgy and craftsmanship. Early artifacts display advanced techniques in smelting, alloying, and shaping metals long before such technologies should have been accessible. Their artisans worked with precision difficult to reconcile with a supposedly emergent civilization. This echoes puzzling finds in other parts of the world. Enigmatic metal objects buried within prehistory, anomalously advanced polishing techniques on megalithic stones, and tools whose functional sophistication outpaces their archaeological context. These scattered clues point toward technological continuities ruptured by disaster, then revived by communities that remembered just enough to rebuild. Then there are the parallels in mythologies. Flood stories, sky gods descending to restore order, pre-flood rulers, catastrophic resets, and golden ages abruptly ended. These motifs span continents. The Maya, the Egyptians, the Hindus, the Greeks, and the Sumerians all tell variations of the same story. A world before ours, advanced in ways we cannot fully comprehend, brought down by calamity and remembered only through sacred narrative. Mainstream scholarship tends to view these stories as psychological archetypes or environmental metaphors, yet their consistency suggests they may encode a shared memory of civilizational collapse. If a global cataclysm tied to the end of the Ice Age reshaped coastlines and destroyed settlements, it is not unreasonable to imagine that its survivors preserved the story in the only medium available to them, myth. Geological evidence lends weight to these narratives. Sudden sea level rises, meltwater pulses, and rapid climatic destabilization mark the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene. These events were capable of annihilating coastal civilizations whose remains now lie hundreds of feet underwater. Modern sonar mapping has revealed submerged structures off the coasts of India, Turkey, Greece, Japan, and the Americas, sites whose dates and complexity defy simple explanation. While not definitive proof of a lost civilization, these discoveries challenge the neat boundaries of the historical timeline, suggesting that much of humanity's story lies beneath the waves. In this context, Sumer becomes not the first civilization, but the first reconstruction after the deluge erased its predecessors. The linguistic isolation of Sumerian also raises questions that modern scholars struggle to answer. Despite extensive study, the language remains unconnected to any known family, an orphan of prehistory. Alternative theories propose that this isolation reflects a deeper break, a lineage severed by catastrophe, leaving only a small remnant to carry the tongue forward. When combined with the abrupt appearance of writing, astronomy, and mathematics, the linguistic anomaly supports the hypothesis that Sumer inherited its cultural DNA from a civilization whose broader presence was erased. Modern interpretations also grapple with the Sumerian king list, which includes both historical rulers and antediluvian kings, whose reigns span impossible durations. Mainstream scholars treat these vast lifespans as symbolic, yet alternative researchers argue that the list may encode cycles of time or eras of governance inherited from a previous world. If the early names represent traditions or epochs rather than individuals, the king list could preserve a compressed chronology of a pre-flood civilization. This interpretation aligns with the global pattern of ancient genealogies featuring long-lived patriarchs or divine rulers, suggesting a shared mechanism for compressing deep time into lineage. But perhaps the most provocative anomalies arise from astronomical alignments preserved in ancient myths and temples. When researchers compare the sky positions implied by Sumerian cosmology to actual celestial configurations across millennia, they find correlations that point to symbolic origins far earlier than the civilization itself. Some myths appear to reference constellations in positions they held 12 to 15,000 years ago during the final stages of the Ice Age. This temporal disjunction hints at stories transmitted across countless generations, surviving upheaval only to be reinterpreted in new cultural contexts. Such inconsistencies have driven a growing field of inquiry exploring the possibility of a lost civilization that predates known history. These researchers do not deny the achievements of early cultures. Rather, they argue that the foundations of those achievements were inherited. They point to Göbekli Tepe's inexplicable sophistication, to submerged ruins off the Gulf of Cambay, to anomalous artifacts in the Americas, and to genetic evidence suggesting rapid cultural diffusion in the early Holocene. Their theories, though speculative, arise from the attempt to weave together scattered anomalies into a coherent narrative, a narrative that grants the Sumerians their rightful place not as the first inventors, but as the first remembering. This modern reinterpretation does not replace traditional archaeology. It expands its horizon. It treats the gaps in the record not as accidents of excavation, but as invitations to consider deeper possibilities. It recognizes that the Earth's rising seas, shifting rivers, and violent climatic events have likely hidden more evidence than they have preserved. And it suggests that the brilliance of Sumer may represent the final glimmer of a far older flame, one nearly extinguished by disaster, then carried through darkness by survivors determined to ensure that their world, however shattered, would not be forgotten. Yet speculation alone cannot resolve the tension between what Sumer reveals and what history accepts. To approach the truth more closely, we must turn to science. Geology, genetics, climatology, and archaeology to test whether these alternative theories can withstand scrutiny. The next chapter brings us to that confrontation, where the physical evidence of the Earth either grounds or challenges the narrative of a forgotten civilization before the flood. Science steps into this unfolding mystery not as an adversary to myth, but as an unexpected ally. Across disciplines, geology, climatology, archaeology, and even paleogenetics, evidence continues to surface that aligns not with the clean, gradual progression once assumed for early civilization, but with a far more turbulent and fragmented history. The Earth itself carries scars of sudden changes, violent upheavals, and drowned landscapes that suggest human societies may have risen and fallen long before the emergence of Sumer. These scientific traces do not prove the existence of a forgotten civilization, yet they form a constellation of clues pointing toward the possibility that Sumer's brilliance was not a spontaneous spark, but the rekindling of a flame nearly extinguished by ancient catastrophe. The geological record is the first witness. Around the end of the last ice age, roughly 12 to 14,000 years ago, the planet underwent extreme climatic instability. Sudden meltwater pulses sent sea levels surging upward by hundreds of feet, redrawing coastlines and drowning vast lowland regions that had once been fertile grounds for human settlement. The Persian Gulf Basin, now submerged beneath shallow seas, is believed to have hosted rivers, lakes, and deltas capable of supporting early populations. Sediment cores reveal signs of rapid flooding and shifting salinity levels, consistent with a landscape overtaken by rising waters. If a coastal civilization once thrived there, its ruins would now lie buried beneath layers of silt, unreachable with current excavation methods. The Sumerians' earliest myths, centered on water, creation, and loss, may reflect memories of such inundations preserved through oral tradition. Climatology adds further weight to this narrative. The Younger Dryas, a sudden global cooling event, disrupted ecosystems and forced migrations across continents. Its abrupt onset and end, events still debated by scientists, would have destabilized early human communities, creating conditions in which cultural memory compressed into myth. For groups living near coastlines or river deltas, the combination of climatic stress and rising seas would have been catastrophic. Survivors fleeing inland, carrying fragments of their former culture, could easily have seeded the traditions that later manifested in regions like Mesopotamia. In this light, the flood myth becomes not a singular event, but the cultural echo of multiple overlapping catastrophes, reinforced by generations of memory. Archaeology, once limited to dry land, now turns increasingly toward submerged environments. Sonar mapping, underwater drones, and sediment analysis have revealed structures on continental shelves that resemble harbors, foundations, and even possible walls. Off the Gulf of Cambay in India, researchers uncovered geometric patterns beneath the sea that some argue may be remnants of ancient settlements thousands of years older than mainstream timelines allow. Near Japan's Yonaguni coast, stepped formations spark debate over whether they are natural or artificially modified. In the Mediterranean, submerged structures off Malta and Greece challenge assumptions about the earliest architectural traditions. While none of these discoveries constitute definitive proof, they collectively suggest that much of humanity's early story lies beneath waters that conceal more than they reveal. Genetics offers another layer of complexity. Modern population studies show patterns of sudden dispersal and mixing around the time of the last major climatic upheavals. These movements hint at mass migrations from regions no longer visible on the map, potentially the flooded coastlines of the ancient world. Certain mitochondrial lineages appear widely distributed across Eurasia and the Near East in ways that suggest a common point of origin long before agriculture emerged. If survivors from coastal civilizations migrated inland, they would have carried not only their genes, but their cultural fragments, stories, symbols, technologies that would later crystallize into the traditions of early civilizations like Sumer. Even the study of sediment layers in ancient Mesopotamia reveals unexpected discontinuities. In cities like Shuruppak, and Kish, thick layers of water-deposited silt interrupt habitation levels, marking periods when flooding reshaped the landscape. While these local floods were not global events, they mirror the narrative structure of the flood myth when read collectively. Each inundation served as a reminder of deeper ancestral memory, reinforcing the cultural conviction that humanity had survived a catastrophe of planetary scale. Science does not fully validate the myth, yet neither does it dismiss it. Instead, it reveals a world vulnerable to sudden change, where memories of disaster could survive long enough to influence the birth of civilization. Physics and astronomy also offer intriguing possibilities. Researchers studying precessional cycles, orbital mechanics, and Earth's axial tilt have noted correlations between certain catastrophic events and celestial alignments. While these ideas remain speculative, they illustrate how ancient sky watchers, aware of cyclical patterns, might have interpreted cosmic rhythms as reflections of earthly upheaval. If the survivors of an earlier civilization possessed a sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles, their knowledge could easily have been encoded into the myths and rituals inherited by Sumer. Modern science, far from disproving such interpretations, sometimes reveals that ancient observations were more precise than expected. Yet the most compelling scientific counterbalance is simply the growing awareness of how much evidence remains inaccessible. More than 70% of the Earth's archaeological potential lies underwater or beneath dense sedimentation. Our current maps of human origins are shaped by the narrow band of land we can excavate, not the submerged plains where early cultures may have flourished. The Fertile Crescent, for all its importance, represents only a fragment of the world accessible to ancient peoples. The true cradle of civilization may lie offshore, preserved beneath layers of sand and sea, waiting for technologies capable of revealing it. Science does not confirm the existence of a lost civilization before Sumer, but it opens the door wider than ever before. It acknowledges the drastic environmental changes that could erase entire cultures, the genetic signatures of migrations from unknown homelands, the anomalous sophistication of early societies, and the submerged landscapes that remain unexplored. These elements do not prove the narrative woven through Sumerian myth, but they refuse to contradict it. They form a bridge between the world we can measure and the world hinted at through ancient stories. From this intersection of science and speculation emerges a compelling possibility that Sumer was not humanity's first act, but its first recovery, a civilization rising from the plains like a whispered memory of one that the earth itself attempted to bury. And if this is true, then the next step in our journey leads us toward the broader question at the heart of this entire narrative: whether the brilliance of Sumer reflects the inheritance of a lost civilization whose knowledge still echoes faintly through time, waiting for us to listen. The possibility that Sumer inherited the remnants of a forgotten civilization invites a profound shift in how we understand the human story. It suggests that the rise of cities in Mesopotamia was not the spontaneous dawn of culture, but the slow rekindling of embers carried through darkness by survivors who refused to surrender their memory. When viewed through this lens, Sumer becomes the first successful attempt to resurrect the principles of an older world. Its mathematics, its astronomy, its symbolic vocabulary, its structured governance, and the deep intuition that humanity had lived through cycles of creation and destruction long before the first clay tablets were pressed. Instead of standing as the cradle of civilization, Sumer becomes its heir, the child of a lineage obscured by catastrophe, yet still pulsing beneath its myths, temples, and institutions. This perspective transforms the familiar narrative of progress into something more cyclical, more fragile. Civilizations do not simply rise, they return. They rebuild themselves from fragments preserved through trauma, reconstructing frameworks whose origins stretch back into eras erased by the sea. In Sumer, we find the first clear evidence of this rebirth. A people who seemed to remember more than they should, who built with confidence they never had the chance to earn, who spoke a language belonging to no known family, and who told stories of ages too vast to fit within the boundaries of known history. Their achievements feel less like innovation than restoration, as though they were assembling a mosaic from shattered pieces of a picture remembered only in outline. If a lost civilization once existed before the flood, its final legacy would not be its cities, now hidden beneath ocean floors. It would be the knowledge carried by its last survivors, knowledge encoded in myth and ritual, disguised as divine command, preserved in song and symbol until a stable world emerged again. Sumer's sudden brilliance becomes intelligible only when we acknowledge this possibility. Its systems appear whole cloth, not because they were invented in isolation, but because they had been refined elsewhere, in a world that had centuries to observe the stars, experiment with numbers, shape its architecture, and develop myths that mapped cosmic cycles onto human life. The survivors of that world would have carried not blueprints or libraries, but memory. And memory, when cultivated through ritual and reverence, can outlast even stone. The cyclical nature of destruction and rebirth appears everywhere in Sumerian thought. Their myths describe ages that begin, flourish, and collapse, only to begin again under new cosmic configurations. Their rituals reenact creation emerging from chaos, reminding worshippers of a primordial event that reshaped the earth. Their king lists treat history not as a straight line, but as a sequence of ages separated by catastrophe. Even their concept of kingship descending from above hints at a transfer of authority from a previous world to a new one. It is as if the Sumerians understood instinctively that civilizations are fragile constructs, vulnerable to forces beyond human control. And this awareness may have been the inheritance of ancestors who lived through a collapse so profound that it reshaped the trajectory of the human species. This cyclical view resonates across the globe. In Egypt, the first time describes a golden age preceding recorded history. In India, the Yuga cycles trace vast epochs punctuated by destruction. In Mesoamerica, the world is remade repeatedly after floods and fires. In Greece, Hesiod speaks of ages of gold, silver, and bronze before the present Iron Age. These narratives are often treated as symbolic, yet their universality suggests they may encode collective memory of civilizational cycles observed long before writing emerged. The Sumerians, as the first to formalize their records, preserve the clearest expression of this deeper truth. Their civilization may have been the first successful attempt to reclaim the blueprint of a lost world, an attempt guided by the knowledge of survivors who understood both the fragility of order and the necessity of preserving it. Contemplating this legacy forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility, that human progress is not linear but precarious. Civilizations may rise to extraordinary heights only to fall into obscurity, leaving behind faint echoes in myth and ritual. Knowledge, once lost, must be rediscovered painstakingly, often without awareness of its ancient origins. The Sumerians' achievements remind us that humanity is capable of losing far more than we imagine, and equally capable of rebuilding when circumstances allow. Their sudden sophistication serves not as evidence of alien intervention, as some have proposed, but as testimony to the resilience of cultural memory. The gods they revered may have been nothing more than the last heirs of a world washed away, yet their teachings shaped millennia of human development. This understanding reshapes our relationship to the past. It invites humility, reminding us that our own civilization stands on the shoulders of countless forgotten ones. It suggests that the breakthroughs we celebrate, writing, astronomy, mathematics, may not be inventions, but rediscoveries, echoes of ideas forged in epochs we no longer remember. And if this is true, then we must ask what fragments of our own world might survive future cataclysms, and what stories our descendants will tell about us when the records are reduced to myth. The cycle of rise, fall, and resurrection may be the fundamental rhythm of humanity, a pattern stretching across tens of thousands of years. As we stand at this precipice of interpretation, the Sumerians no longer appear as a mysterious anomaly, but as a bridge. They connect us to a past that the earth buried, to lessons encoded in clay and stone, to a lineage of survival stretching beyond the horizon of recorded time. And with this realization, we approach the final chapter of our journey, a reflection on what this lost heritage means for us today, and what it reveals about the deeper potential of the human story. The story of Sumer, when viewed through the widening lens of forgotten epics, becomes more than an archaeological puzzle. It becomes a mirror held up to humanity itself, reflecting not only what we have achieved, but what we have endured. If the Sumerians were indeed the heirs of a civilization drowned by the shifting waters of a world in chaos, then their triumph was not in inventing the foundations of culture, but in remembering them. Their clay tablets, their temples aligned with the sky, their myths of gods who guided humanity through darkness. All these become testimonies to an ancient resilience, the determination of a species that refused to surrender its knowledge, even when the earth itself seemed determined to erase it. Sumer stands as the first luminous point after a vast night, the place where humanity regained its footing and began once more to build. This perspective invites a humbling reflection on the nature of civilization. We are accustomed to thinking of progress as an upward arc, a steady ascent from primitive beginnings to sophisticated modernity. Yet the evidence we have explored suggests a cycle far more intricate. Civilizations rise, flourish, and collapse, leaving behind only fragments for future ages to rediscover. The Sumerians may have been the first to rebuild after the last great catastrophe, but they were likely not the first to rise. Countless others may have lived and died along vanished coastlines, their stories preserved only in the whisper of myth. This understanding transforms our relationship with deep time. It reminds us that the ruins we uncover may be only the latest layer in a geological palimpsest, that beneath the clay of Mesopotamia lie not only sediments, but memories older than any tablet can preserve. What survives a cataclysm is not stone, nor cities, nor monuments, but knowledge carried in minds determined to preserve meaning amid loss. The Sumerians taught us that memory, when ritualized, becomes tradition, when inscribed, becomes history, when mythologized, becomes legend. Through these layers, fragments of earlier worlds travel forward, altered but not erased. Even when we no longer recognize the origins of our stories, the echoes remain. The flood, the descent of the gods, the cycles of cosmic ages, the language without ancestors. These are not just myths, but hints of a grander human inheritance. They call us to view our species not as a recent innovation, but as the latest chapter in a saga shaped by endurance. This reinterpretation does not demand that we abandon science. Instead, it invites us to broaden its scope. The drowned coastlines of the world remain largely unseen, awaiting technologies that might one day reveal their secrets. The anomalies in ancient astronomy, mathematics, and architecture hint at intellectual traditions predating known history. Geological upheavals remind us that the Earth reshapes itself with little regard for the fragile societies that cling to its surface. And myths, rather than being dismissed as superstition, may hold codes of remembrance crafted by cultures that hoped their stories would outlive their ruins. Science and myth, when read together, paint a picture of humanity as both vulnerable and resilient, capable of falling into obscurity yet rising again with knowledge salvaged from the brink. In this light, the legacy of Sumer becomes a quiet warning. Civilization is not guaranteed. It is a fragile construct, dependent on memory, cooperation, and the ability to transmit wisdom across generations. The Sumerians inherited the remnants of a world undone by forces beyond its control, and they rebuilt with reverence for the past and an acute awareness of the future's uncertainty. Their story encourages us to consider what fragments we would preserve if faced with similar upheaval. What knowledge would we deem essential? What myths would we craft to carry truth beyond the reach of collapse? And would our descendants recognize the signals we sent through time, or would they interpret our memories as divine stories from an age lost to legend? As we conclude this journey, we return to the question that set it into motion. What if Sumer's gods were survivors of a dead civilization? The answer, though speculative, reveals more about us than about them. It reveals that humanity's past may be deeper than our records, richer than our assumptions, and more cyclical than our narratives allow. It suggests that beneath every myth lies a kernel of truth, and beneath every ruin lies an echo of a world we were not meant to forget. Sumer, in all its startling brilliance, becomes the bridge between the remembered and the forgotten, between the world before the flood and the world that rose after it. And so we stand at the threshold of mystery, gazing back at the cradle of civilization, not as a beginning, but as a rebirth. The tablets fall silent, the ziggurats crumble, the stars drift in their ancient patterns. Yet the question remains, lingering in the space between myth and history, how much of our world today is simply another cycle beginning anew?